In the depths of a Vietnamese jungle, a special forces team was about to discover the true meaning of being surrounded. What started as a standard recon mission turned deadly when an entire Viet Cong battalion encircled their position, cutting off all escape routes. Captain Elias Kane wasn't your typical special forces officer. For 15 years, he had been Delta Force's most enigmatic strategist, known for turning impossible situations into masterclasses of psychological warfare. When the Viet Cong launched their coordinated attack, they had no idea they were walking into the mind of a tactical savant. Kane's response would trigger a chain of events that would transform both hunter and hunted. What began as a desperate last stand would become a revelation in military history. The dense Vietnamese jungle would never be the same after Kane showed the world that true warfare transcends mere combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The jungle breathed at night. Private John Sparky Dawson felt it in his bones, the way the air shifted thick with moisture and secrets, how the darkness seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. His fingers traced the familiar contours of his radio set as he followed Captain Kane's silent hand signals. Each step measured, deliberate. The rest of the Special Forces team moved like shadows through the undergrowth, their movements a testament to years of training and survival instinct. Captain Elias Kane paused at the front of the formation, his silhouette barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. There was something about the way he held himself, straight-backed, head cocked slightly, that made Sparky think of a predator scenting the air. The captain had been leading them deeper into enemy territory for hours, each step taking them further from their last known coordinates. Sergeant Lucas "Lucky" O'Connor moved up beside Kane, his weathered face tight with concern. "Sir," he whispered, barely audible above the jungle's nocturnal chorus. "We're well past the planned insertion point." Kane didn't immediately respond. His eyes, reflecting what little starlight filtered through the canopy, scanned the tree line. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority that had earned him his reputation. "The intel was wrong, Sergeant. The VC have shifted their operations. I can feel it." O'Connor's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. 20 years in Special Forces had taught him when to push and when to hold his tongue. Still, something about this mission had been nagging at him since they'd crossed the river 3 clicks back. Corporal Miguel "Mick" Reyes watched the exchange from his position, his young face showing nothing but confidence in their captain. He'd heard the stories about Kane, how he'd led impossible missions, how he seemed to think 3 moves ahead of the enemy. To Reyes, following Kane wasn't just duty, it was an education in warfare. The first shot came without warning. The crack of the AK-47 shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed immediately by the distinctive whoosh of an RPG. Kane's voice cut through the chaos. "Contact front, 3 o'clock. Sparky's world exploded in a cascade of splinters and shrapnel as the RPG struck a tree near his position. The radio on his back crackled and died, pieces of it spraying into the undergrowth. In the strobing muzzle flashes, he caught glimpses of movement, shadows within shadows, the jungle itself seeming to come alive with enemy fighters. "Circle. Formation!" Kane's command carried over the firefight. "Reyes, 12 o'clock. O'Connor, take the rear." The team moved with practiced precision, but O'Connor could already see it. They were surrounded. The Viet Cong had been waiting, their positions carefully prepared. This wasn't a chance encounter, this was an ambush. Kane's voice remained steady, almost contemplative as he directed their defense. "Conserve ammunition, short, controlled bursts, make them think we're stronger than we are." He moved between positions, adjusting fields of fire with small gestures, his calm presence an anchor in the chaos. Sparky's hands shook as he tried to salvage something from his shattered radio. "Sir, communications are down. The main set's destroyed." "They knew," O'Connor muttered more to himself than anyone else. "They knew exactly where we'd be." But Kane's expression, visible now in the growing dawn light, showed no surprise. If anything, there was a glint of something else in his eyes. something that made O'Connor's combat-honed instincts prickle with unease. The captain was surveying the battlefield not like a man trapped, but like a chess master examining the board. "Sir," Reyes called out between bursts of covering fire. "What's the play? We're cut off here." Kane's lips curved into the barest suggestion of a smile. "No, Corporal, we're exactly where we need to be." He turned to address the team, his voice carrying an almost hypnotic certainty. "The jungle is about to become our ally. And our friends out there?" He gestured to the surrounding forest where muzzle flashes marked the enemy positions. "They're about to learn why they should have left us a way out." O'Connor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. He'd seen that look before, on another mission, one that had ended with victory but at a cost that still haunted his dreams. Kane wasn't trapped. Kane was hunting. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the canopy, the shooting gradually died down. The Viet Cong were conserving ammunition, settling in for a siege. They thought they had trapped an American Special Forces team, but watching Kane's calculated movements, his measured commands, the way his eyes mapped the terrain with cold precision, O'Connor wondered who was really trapped, and more importantly, had any of this been an accident at all. The jungle held its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move in this deadly game. And in the growing light, Captain Kane began to plan. The morning mist clung to the jungle floor as Kane gathered his men in their makeshift defensive position. The firefight had died down to sporadic shots. Probing fire meant to keep them pinned while the Viet Cong tightened their noose. But Kane's eyes held that same unsettling gleam that had made O'Connor's skin crawl earlier. "They expect us to do one of two things," Kane said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Either hold position and wait for rescue or attempt to break out in force." His finger traced a pattern in the dirt, an intricate web of lines that seemed to make sense only to him. "We're going to do neither." O'Connor watched as Kane laid out his plan, each detail more audacious than the last. The captain wasn't just thinking about survival. He was orchestrating a symphony of deception that bordered on madness. "Sir," O'Connor interjected, "splitting our forces like this, we're already outnumbered." Kane's reply came with that same unnerving smile. "Numbers are irrelevant when the enemy can't trust what they see." He turned to Reyes and Dawson. "You two will move east, leaving clear signs of a larger force. Make it obvious, broken branches, multiple boot prints. I want them to think we're twice our size." Reyes nodded eagerly, but Dawson's hands trembled as he checked his weapon. The young radio operator's eyes darted between the trees, seeing enemies in every shadow. Meanwhile, Kane continued, "We'll set up a series of false positions, tripwires here, here, and here." His finger marked points on his dirt map. "Deadfalls in these channels. They'll expect basic booby traps. We'll give them complexity instead. Layers within layers." O'Connor watched Reyes absorbing every word, the young corporal's face showing nothing but admiration. But O'Connor had seen this before. Commanders who confused brilliance with recklessness, whose elaborate plans got men killed. 100 meters away, hidden in the dense foliage, Lieutenant Bao observed the American position through field glasses. 20 years of jungle warfare had taught him to read an enemy's movements like a book. But these patterns, they made no sense. The Americans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Kane's team worked with precision, if not complete understanding. They rigged elaborate tripwires that triggered multiple responses, one explosion leading to another, forcing the enemy to move in predictable directions. Kane called them chaos corridors, but O'Connor saw them for what they were, killing zones. "Remember," Kane instructed as they worked, "when you fire, make it count. 3 shots from one position, move 5 meters, 2 shots from another. Make them think we have them surrounded." His voice carried an almost theatrical quality. "The jungle is our stage. We're about to put on quite a show." Reyes and Dawson moved through their assigned pattern, leaving signs of movement that any trained guerrilla fighter would spot, but signs that told a false story. As they worked, Reyes couldn't help but marvel at the intricacy of Kane's strategy. It's brilliant, he whispered to Dawson. The way he thinks, it's like he's playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Dawson's response was less enthusiastic. Yeah, but what if we're the pieces, not the players? The morning wore on, and the jungle came alive with phantom soldiers. Kane had them firing from multiple positions, moving in patterns that suggested a force 3 times their size. The Viet Cong's probing attacks became more hesitant, more cautious. O'Connor found Kane standing alone, studying the tree line with an almost artistic appreciation. Sir, he said, keeping his voice low, the men are in position, but we're burning through ammunition fast. If this doesn't work— It's already working, Kane interrupted, gesturing to the jungle. Listen. The sporadic enemy fire had taken on a new pattern, more random, less coordinated. The Viet Cong were second-guessing their intelligence, questioning what they thought they knew. In his hidden command post, Lieutenant Bao studied the Americans' movements with growing frustration. His scouts reported confusion, trails that led nowhere, positions that seemed to shift like smoke. And through it all, he sensed a pattern just beyond his grasp, like a word on the tip of his tongue. As noon approached, the jungle had become Kane's elaborate puzzle box. Every tree concealed a potential trap. Every shadow might hide an American soldier, or might be just another carefully crafted illusion. Beautiful, isn't it? Kane mused, more to himself than to O'Connor. The way fear multiplies uncertainty. The way doubt spreads like poison. O'Connor watched his commander's face, seeing not just calculation there, but something closer to pleasure. Kane wasn't just fighting a battle, he was conducting an experiment in human psychology, with both his enemies and his own men as unwitting subjects. In the distance, they heard Reyes and Dawson executing their part of the plan, controlled bursts of fire from multiple positions, creating the impression of a larger force on the move. But O'Connor's attention was on Kane, watching the way the captain's eyes lit up at each new sound of confusion in the enemy ranks. The Viet Cong's attacks had all but ceased now, their confidence shaken by the Americans' apparent strength and unpredictable movements. Kane had bought them time, but O'Connor couldn't shake the feeling that time wasn't what the captain was really after. As the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, Kane gathered his team once more. His next word sent a chill down O'Connor's spine. Now that we have their attention, let's show them what real fear looks like. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight as Lieutenant Bao studied the elaborate trap he'd discovered. A tripwire connected to nothing, a false trail that doubled back on itself. These weren't the desperate tricks of surrounded men. They were invitations. And in that moment, Bao understood. He wasn't hunting Captain Kane. Kane was hunting him. Move, Bao commanded his men in Vietnamese. But not where he expects. Let's see how he plays when we change the rules. Half a kilometer away, Kane's team pushed through the dense undergrowth. Their earlier success had bought them breathing room, but O'Connor could sense the change in the air. The jungle had gone too quiet. Sir, O'Connor moved closer to Kane, keeping his voice low. We're being herded. Kane's response was almost cheerful. Of course we are, Sergeant. The question is, into whose trap? He pointed to a barely visible path through the foliage. That way. That's exactly where they want us to go, O'Connor protested, his patience finally wearing thin. We should double back, try to break through their western flank while we still have the chance. Kane's eyes met his, and O'Connor saw something there that made his blood run cold. Not madness, but a calculating intelligence so deep it might as well have been. Trust me, Sergeant. Sometimes the best path forward is straight into the dragon's mouth. The first shot came from their left, a single crack that sent birds scattering into the canopy. Then silence. 10 seconds later, another shot from the right. Not trying to hit them, just letting them know they were surrounded. They're toying with us, Dawson whispered, clutching his backup radio, their last link to the outside world. His fingers moved across the dial, searching for any frequency that might cut through the interference. Sir, I think I'm getting something. The air erupted with gunfire, not the probing shots from before, but a coordinated barrage that seemed to come from every direction at once. Kane's elaborate deceptions had bought them time, but Bao had used that time well. The Viet Cong had mapped every escape route, noted every pattern. "Contact front," Reyes shouted, dropping to one knee and returning fire. "There—" His words cut off as he dove for cover, where there had been empty jungle moments, before shadow figures now moved with lethal purpose. Kane's voice carried over the chaos, still unnaturally calm. "Sparky, get on that radio. Everyone else, controlled pairs, conserve ammunition." He moved between positions as if the bullets couldn't touch him, adjusting fields of fire with small gestures. Dawson's fingers flew across the radio dials. "I've almost got it. There's something. Wait." His words ended in a cry of frustration as a bullet found the radio, sending fragments of electronics spraying into the air. Their last connection to the outside world died in his hands. "We're alone," he whispered, the reality of their situation finally hitting him full force. "We're completely alone out here." "No," Kane corrected, and there was something like satisfaction in his voice. "Now we're free." O'Connor saw it then, the way Kane's plan had been leading to this moment. Every deception, every careful manipulation, had been designed not to escape the trap, but to make it complete. They were cut off, isolated, with no choice but to follow Kane deeper into whatever game he was playing. "Fall back by teams," Kane ordered. "Use the density for cover. They can't target what they can't see." His eyes gleamed with an almost predatory light. "Let them think they're pushing us where they want us to go." The team began their fighting retreat, moving deeper into the jungle's embrace. The vegetation was thicker here, limiting visibility to mere meters. The Viet Cong's fire became more sporadic as they lost clear lines of sight. Lieutenant Bao, watching through his field glasses, allowed himself a grim smile. The Americans were good. Better than good. Their retreat looked chaotic but followed a pattern so subtle it was almost invisible. Kane was leading his men like a maestro conducting an orchestra of death. "Sir." O'Connor caught up to Kane during a brief lull, his voice hard. "This isn't just about survival anymore, is it? What are you really doing out here?" Kane turned to him, and for a moment his mask slipped. O'Connor saw something in his commander's eyes that would haunt him for years to come. A void where humanity should have been, filled instead with pure tactical brilliance. "Survival?" Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Sergeant, that's thinking too small. We're not trying to survive the jungle." He gestured to the dense foliage surrounding them, to the enemy moving like ghosts through the shadows. "We're becoming it." As if to punctuate his words, a scream echoed through the trees. One of Bao's men had found one of Kane's more elaborate traps. The jungle was changing hands, becoming Kane's weapon, his laboratory. The team pushed on through the gathering darkness, going deeper into territory that hadn't seen human footprints in years. They were isolated, hunted, their situation growing more desperate by the hour. But watching Kane's face in the fading light, O'Connor realized that desperate men were exactly what their captain wanted them to be. Because desperate men would follow any order, believe any strategy, as long as it offered a chance at survival, even if that chance was just another of Kane's carefully crafted illusions. Dusk crept through the jungle like blood in water. The firefight had ended hours ago, but the silence that followed was worse. A living thing that pressed against their eardrums and made every snapped twig sound like an artillery shell. Kane had ordered them to maintain absolute quiet. They communicated through hand signals, and even their breathing seemed too loud in the oppressive stillness. The captain moved among them like a ghost, checking positions, adjusting their formation with small gestures that somehow conveyed volumes. O'Connor watched him with growing unease. The rest of them were exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and fear. But Kane looked energized. His movements were precise, his eyes bright with an almost feverish intensity. "Sir," O'Connor finally whispered, unable to contain himself any longer. We need to talk about the endgame here. Kane's head tilted, slightly, reminding O'Connor of a predator considering its next meal. Endgame, Sergeant? We're just getting started. He gestured to the jungle around them. Look how beautiful it is, the way they're moving out there thinking they're hunting us. The way fear changes their patterns makes them predictable. With all due respect, O'Connor's voice hardened, these men aren't your science experiment. They're soldiers who trust you to get them out alive. For a moment, something flickered across Kane's face. Not anger, but something colder. Trust? He smiled, and O'Connor felt his skin crawl. Trust is a weapon, Sergeant. Like any weapon, it's most effective when the target doesn't see it coming. Before O'Connor could respond, Kane was moving again, gathering the team, for his next set of instructions. We're going to double back, he explained, his voice barely above a breath. Leave signs of movement heading east, obvious ones. Make them think exhaustion is making us sloppy. Reyes nodded, but O'Connor caught something new in the young corporal's expression, the first hint of doubt. Even Kane's most devoted follower was beginning to sense that something wasn't right. They moved through the gathering darkness with agonizing slowness, every step calculated. Kane had them planting false trails, broken branches, disturbed earth, even a few drops of blood from their earlier wounds. But O'Connor noticed how these signs formed a pattern too perfect to be accidental. Kane wasn't just laying a false trail, he was composing a story in broken twigs and blood spots. The first sign that something was wrong was a bird call that didn't belong. Too regular, too precise. Kane's hand shot up, freezing them in place. 30 meters ahead, a shadow moved against shadows. A Viet Cong scout moving parallel to their position. He hadn't seen them yet, but one wrong move, one misplaced step, would give them away. The team held their breath, weapons ready, but Kane didn't reach for his rifle. Instead, he drew a knife. Long, matte black, designed for silence. His eyes met O'Connor's, and in them was a challenge. Watch this. What happened next would haunt O'Connor's dreams for years to come. Kane moved through the underbrush like water, each step placing his foot exactly where it needed to be. The scout never heard him coming. One moment the man was alive, scanning the jungle for signs of Americans. The next, Kane was behind him, one hand over his mouth, the knife describing a precise arc. They lowered the body silently, but not before. O'Connor saw the look on Kane's face. Not the grim determination of a soldier doing his duty, but the satisfied expression of an artist admiring his work. Dawson turned away, his face pale. Even Reyes, who had worshipped every move Kane made, seemed shaken by the cold efficiency of the kill. This wasn't combat. This was something else entirely. Beautiful, Kane whispered, wiping his knife. Clean. Did you see how he moved? The way he was scanning? They're learning our patterns, adapting, but that makes them predictable in new ways. His voice took on an almost lecturing tone. Fear changes everything, the way they move, the way they think. Every emotion leaves a signature if you know how to read it. O'Connor felt his hand tighten on his rifle. He wasn't sure anymore who frightened him more, the enemy out there in the darkness or the man standing beside him with blood on his hands and satisfaction in his eyes. Sir, Reyes spoke up, his voice uncertain for the first time since the mission began. Shouldn't we try to break contact? Find a way back to friendly lines? Kane's smile widened fractionally. Or break contact? Why would we want to do that? They're exactly where I want them. He turned to face his team, and in the failing light, his eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. Every move they make, every position they take, brings them one step closer to understanding. And when they finally understand... He left the thought unfinished, but his smile said everything his words didn't. The jungle pressed in around them, alive with unseen eyes and hidden movements. Somewhere out there, Lieutenant Bao was watching, waiting, trying to understand the mind of the man he was hunting. But O'Connor was beginning to realize that understanding Kane might be the most dangerous thing of all, because Kane wasn't just fighting a war. He was conducting an experiment in fear, using both his enemies and his own men as unwitting subjects. And the deeper they went into his jungle laboratory, the harder it became to tell which was which. Night had swallowed the jungle whole when they heard the first whisper. It came drifting through the darkness like smoke. An American voice, weak but clear. "Help, please. Anybody out there?" The team had taken shelter in a shallow depression, their backs pressed against the wet earth. Hours of tension had left them raw, jumping at shadows. But this was new. "Charlie? Charlie? That you?" The voice was closer now, carrying the flat accent of the Midwest. "I can hear you moving, please." Dawson's hands trembled on his weapon. "That's English, American, we have to—" "Quiet," O'Connor hissed, but he could see the desperate hope in the young radio man's eyes. After hours of isolation, any friendly voice seemed like salvation. Reyes shifted, his training warring with his instincts. "Sir," he whispered to Kane, "if there's an American out there—" "Think," O'Connor cut in. "How long have we been moving? How long since we lost contact? Where would another American have come from?" But Kane held up his hand for silence, his head tilted as he listened to the voice with almost clinical interest. His eyes had that same unsettling gleam they'd shown during the scout's execution, the look of a man studying a particularly fascinating specimen. "Please." The voice cracked with pain or fear. "They're coming back. I can hear them." "Oh God, please." Dawson started to rise, but O'Connor's iron grip on his shoulder kept him down. "It's a trap," O'Connor insisted, but doubt gnawed at his certainty. What if he was wrong? What if they were leaving one of their own to die? "Of course it's a trap," Kane spoke finally, his voice carrying that same lecturer's tone that had become increasingly disturbing. "But not the kind you think." He turned to face his team, and in the darkness his smile was barely visible. "Listen to the pauses between words, the way the volume changes. They're using a recording, probably from an earlier prisoner, but they're playing it wrong." "Wrong?" Reyes whispered. "The cadence is off. A man in real pain, real fear." "He wouldn't speak like that. Fear has its own rhythm, its own music. They haven't learned that yet." Kane's voice took on an almost admiring quality. "But they're learning. Each attempt gets better." The voice came again, closer still. "Please, I can see you. Just help me, please." "Sir?" O'Connor's voice was hard. "What's the play here?" Kane's smile widened fractionally. "We let them think it's working. Let them believe we're desperate enough to take the bait." He turned to Dawson, whose face had gone pale in the darkness. "Sparky, call out to him." "Sir?" Dawson's voice cracked. "Trust me. Call out. Sound scared, sound hopeful. Give them what they expect." O'Connor started to protest, but Kane's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Watch," Kane whispered. "Watch how fear changes everything." Dawson swallowed, hard, then called out into the darkness, "Hey, we're here, where are you?" The response was immediate. "Oh, thank God. I'm here. The voice paused, recalibrated. "Follow my voice. Please hurry." Kane's grip tightened on O'Connor's arm. "There. Did you hear it? The mistake? They adjusted too quickly. Real relief has a different sound. They're learning, but they're not there yet." Somewhere in the darkness, multiple somethings moved. The rustle of leaves, the slight shift of weight on jungle soil. The enemy was closing in, using the voice as cover for their approach. "Now," Kane whispered, "we're going to teach them about real fear." He turned to his team, his eyes reflecting what little starlight filtered through the canopy. "They think they understand psychological warfare. They think fear is a simple thing, a voice in the dark, a plea for help. But fear—" His smile became predatory. "Fear is an art form." O'Connor watched as Kane outlined his plan, each detail more disturbing than the last. They weren't just going to avoid the trap. They were going to turn it inside out, use it to create something worse. something that would haunt both sides of this conflict. "Sir," Reyes spoke up, and for the first time, there was real uncertainty in his voice. This isn't right." "Right?" Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "We passed right a long time ago, Corporal. Now we're into something far more interesting." He gestured to the darkness where, the voice still called, still pleaded, they wanted to play with fear. Let's show them what fear really looks like. As Kane laid out his counter-strategy, O'Connor saw Dawson's hands shake harder. The young radio man was close to breaking. The voice, the darkness, the growing realization of what their commander was capable of. It was all becoming too much. But Kane noticed too. He always noticed. And O'Connor saw something in his captain's eyes that chilled him to the bone. Not concern for a struggling soldier, but the fascination of a scientist observing a promising reaction in his test subject. The voice called again, but this time they all heard the artificial quality Kane had pointed out. The wrong rhythms, the too perfect desperation. The enemy's attempt at psychological warfare was good, but not good enough. Not nearly as good as what Kane had planned for them in return. "Listen closely," Kane whispered to his team. "What you're about to see, what you're about to do, this is where the real war begins. Everything before was just preparation." In the darkness, the voice called one more time. But now it wasn't the voice they feared. It was the man who smiled as he listened to it. The voice had changed. No longer just calling for help, it now carried raw panic. "They're coming back. Oh God, please. I can hear them coming back." Kane's plan unfolded with mechanical precision. He had positioned the team in a loose arc, using the natural contours of the jungle to amplify the sound of their movement. Every step, every crushed leaf, was calculated to suggest a desperate rescue attempt. "Please," the voice cracked. "I can hear you out there. Help me." Reyes shifted uncomfortably, his rifle trained on the darkness. "Sir," he whispered to Kane, "what if we're wrong? What if there really is someone out there?" Kane's response was methodical, almost teaching. "Notice the pattern of the pleas. The timing. They're trying to draw us in specific directions." He pointed to barely visible gaps in the foliage. "Kill zones. They've set up interlocking fields of fire. Beautiful work, really." O'Connor watched the younger soldiers' reactions. Dawson had gone pale, his hands white-knuckled on his weapon. Even Reyes, who had followed Kane's every order without question, showed signs of doubt. The voice in the darkness was breaking something in them. Not just their courage, but their sense of who they were. "Charlie?" the voice called again. I can see your shadows, just a little closer." Kane's smile was barely visible in the darkness. "Now watch closely. This is where it gets interesting." He raised his voice slightly. "We're coming. Hold on." The effect was immediate. The voice changed, hope creeping in. "Oh, thank God. Hurry, please hurry." But O'Connor saw what Kane had already known. The subtle shift. In the undergrowth, the way hidden figures adjusted their positions, tightening the noose. The trap was almost ready to spring. "Sir," O'Connor's voice was hard. "We're not really going to—" "Of course we are, Sergeant." Kane's eyes gleamed. "We're going to give them exactly what they expect, and then we're going to learn." The team moved forward in precisely choreographed stumbles, playing the part of desperate men rushing to save a comrade. Each step drew them closer to the kill zone, but also revealed more about the enemy's positions. The voice grew more urgent. "They're coming. Oh God, they're coming back. Please hurry." Kane held up his hand, freezing the team in place. His head tilted, listening not to the voice but to something else. The subtle sounds of weapons being readied, of soldiers adjusting their positions. Then came the sound that would haunt them all, the distinct click of a pistol being cocked, followed by a new voice, Vietnamese, calm and controlled, and Lieutenant Bao's voice. Last chance, Americans, the voice called out in perfect English. Surrender now, or your friend dies. Reyes started forward instinctively, but Kane's grip on his shoulder was like iron. Wait, Kane whispered. Watch. Learn. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. A shot rang out, a single sharp crack that echoed through the jungle. The American voice cut off in mid-plea, replaced by absolute silence. Jesus, Dawson whispered, horror in his voice. They actually... Yes. Kane's voice carried something almost like satisfaction. And now we know exactly where they are. He turned to his team, and in the darkness his eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. That shot told us everything. Position, elevation, even the type of weapon. We just learned more than we lost. O'Connor felt something snap inside him. More than we lost? His voice was dangerous now. That was an American soldier out there. Someone's son, someone's brother. Was it? Kane's smile never wavered. Or was it just a recording, played to make us react exactly as you're reacting now? Either way, the result is the same. We know more than we did before. Reyes stared at his commander, and for the first time, O'Connor saw real fear in the young corporal's eyes. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of the man they'd been following. Sir, Reyes whispered, what are we doing out here? What is this really about? Kane's response chilled them all. We're learning the true language of war, Corporal. Fear, sacrifice, morality, these are just words. What matters is the pattern. The reaction. The way every decision creates ripples we can read, use, predict. Dawson turned away, his shoulders shaking. The young radio man had finally reached his breaking point. We're supposed to be the good guys, he whispered. This isn't what we're supposed to be. Good? Bad? Kane laughed softly. Those are luxury beliefs, Private. Out here there's only what works and what doesn't. What teaches us and what doesn't. He gestured to the darkness where the shot had come from. They just taught us something valuable. Now it's our turn to teach them. O'Connor's hand tightened on his rifle. The conflict between them was no longer hidden. No longer just beneath the surface. It was as real as the jungle around them, as deadly as the enemy in the darkness. But watching Kane's face, seeing the cold calculation there, O'Connor realized something that terrified him more than any enemy could. Kane wasn't just fighting a war, he was enjoying it. The first sign of Bao's counterattack came with the smell of smoke. Not the sharp scent of gunpowder they'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper, more primal, the jungle itself beginning to burn. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lieutenant Bao stood at his command position, watching the controlled fires take hold. 20 years of jungle warfare had taught him patience, taught him to read his enemies like books. And Kane. Kane's book was written in a language Bao knew all too well. He thinks the jungle is his ally, Bao told his officers in Vietnamese. Let's show him how quickly allies can turn. The fires spread in a careful pattern, each blaze positioned to eliminate Kane's carefully prepared escape routes. Smoke began to fill the low ground, forcing the Americans to move exactly where Bao wanted them. Kane noticed the strategy immediately. O'Connor saw it in the way his captain's eyes narrowed, in the slight curl of his lips that might have been either frustration or admiration. Elegant, Kane murmured, studying the pattern of fires. He's not just trying to flush us out. He's speaking to us, showing us he understands the game. This isn't a game, O'Connor growled, but Kane wasn't listening. Look at the fire pattern, Kane continued, his voice taking on that familiar lecturer's tone. See how it mirrors our own deceptions? He's not just countering our moves, he's mocking them. Beautiful. The smoke was getting thicker, forcing them to move higher along the ridgeline. But O'Connor could see they were being herded, each available path leading them closer to what could only be a carefully prepared killing zone. Sir? Reyes called out, his voice tense. "We're running out of options here." Kane's response was almost cheerful. "That's exactly what he wants us to think." He gathered the team closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We're going to give him what he expects, a desperate retreat up the ridge, but watch closely. There's a message in his pattern, and we're going to send one back." They began their withdrawal, moving like hunted animals through the smoke-filled jungle. To anyone watching, it would look like panic, like desperation. But O'Connor saw the calculation in Kane's movements, each stumble choreographed, each pause precisely timed. The first shot came from their left, a single round that shattered the branch by Dawson's head. The young radio man ducked, but Kane's hand on his shoulder kept him from breaking formation. "Wait for it," Kane whispered. 3, 2, 1. The jungle erupted in gunfire. The Viet Cong had positioned themselves perfectly, their fields of fire interlocking in a deadly web. But Kane had read the pattern correctly. There was a gap in their lines, a deliberate weakness that practically screamed escape route. "Thompson, Martinez, take point," Kane ordered. "Everyone else covering fire, make them think we're running blind." The team moved according to Kane's plan, pushing toward the apparent gap in the enemy lines. But O'Connor saw the truth in Kane's eyes. He knew it was a trap. Knew, and was walking into it anyway. The close-quarters battle erupted without warning. One moment they were moving through smoke-filled undergrowth. The next, they were face-to-face with Viet Cong, soldiers who seemed to materialize from the very air. Martinez went down first, a burst of AK-47 fire catching him in the side. His scream cut through the chaos, a sound that would haunt them all. "Contact front," Reyes shouted, dropping to one knee and returning fire. The jungle became a nightmare of muzzle flashes and shadow figures. Kane moved through the chaos like a ghost, his rifle speaking in controlled bursts. Each shot found its mark, but O'Connor noticed something disturbing. Kane wasn't shooting to kill. He was placing his shots deliberately, wounding rather than eliminating, creating a pattern of pain and chaos that seemed to say, "I see your game, and I can play it better." "Sir," Thompson called out, his voice tight with panic. "Martinez is bleeding out." Martinez lay in the undergrowth, his blood soaking into the jungle soil. The wound was bad, the kind that changed everything about a unit's mobility, its options. But Kane's expression as he knelt beside the wounded man showed neither concern nor fear. Instead, there was something like satisfaction in his eyes. "Now it gets interesting," he whispered almost to himself. "Now we see how Bao adapts to this variable." O'Connor felt his grip tighten on his rifle. "That variable is one of our men, sir." Kane looked up, and in his eyes was a coldness that made the jungle seem warm by comparison. "Everything is a variable, Sergeant. Everything is part of the pattern. Even this." He gestured to Martinez's wound. "Especially this." From his position on the ridgeline, Lieutenant Bao watched the aftermath of the engagement through his field glasses. He saw the Americans clustering around their wounded man, saw the way their formation had changed, became more defensive. "Now we have them," he told his officers. But there was no satisfaction in his voice. Because he had seen something else. The way Kane had orchestrated even this seeming defeat. The way he had turned a tactical setback into some kind of twisted experiment. The jungle burned around them, its smoke turning the late afternoon sun blood red. Martinez's labored breathing marked time like a broken metronome. And in the midst of it all, Kane stood watching the fires with an expression that looked disturbingly like love. "The jungle isn't your ally anymore," O'Connor said quietly. Kane's smile was terrible to behold. "No," he agreed. "Now it's our laboratory." Martinez's blood had turned black in the fading light, seeping through the makeshift bandages despite their best efforts. His breathing came in shallow gasps, each one seeming to take more effort than the last. The team had moved him to a shallow depression in the earth, using the jungle's undergrowth for cover. But the smell of blood hung heavy in the air. Kane stood apart from the group, studying their position with that same calculating gaze that had become so familiar. But there was something else in his expression now, a kind of tension, as if he was working through a particularly complex equation. "He's not going to make it," Kane said finally, his voice carrying that clinical detachment that made his words even more chilling. Not like this. Not with us carrying him. O'Connor's head snapped up. Sir? The tactical reality is simple, Kane continued as if discussing the weather. We're being hunted by an enemy who knows this terrain better than we do. Every minute we delay reduces our survival chances exponentially. Martinez is a soldier, O'Connor cut in, his voice hard. One of our men. Kane's smile was gentle, almost paternal, and somehow that made it worse. He's a variable that's shifting the entire equation. Bao knows we won't abandon our wounded. He's counting on that humanity, using it against us. Reyes looked between his two superior officers, his face a mask of confusion and growing horror. He'd followed Kane's orders without question, believed in the captain's tactical genius. But this... There has to be another way, Reyes said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kane turned to him, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes, something almost like sympathy. There's always another way, Corporal. The question is, are you willing to pay its price? Martinez stirred, a weak moan escaping his lips. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, internal bleeding getting worse by the minute. We are not leaving him, O'Connor said, each word carved in stone. His hand hadn't left his rifle, and there was something in his stance that suggested he wasn't just making a statement. He was making a choice. Kane noticed. Kane noticed everything, but instead of anger or frustration, his face showed only curiosity, as if O'Connor's defiance was just another fascinating data point in his ongoing experiment. Interesting, Kane murmured. Then, without warning, he knelt beside Martinez and began removing his own medkit. His movements were precise, almost surgical, as he pulled out fresh bandages and morphine. The team watched in stunned silence as their commander, the man who moments ago had suggested abandoning their wounded, began treating Martinez with expert care. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the wound, cleaning it, applying fresh dressings with perfect precision. Sir? Reyes's voice carried equal parts hope and confusion. Watch and learn, Corporal, Kane said as he worked. Sometimes the most interesting results come from defying tactical logic. His hands never stopped moving, never hesitated. Besides, what's the point of an experiment if you can predict all the variables? O'Connor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the gathering darkness. Kane wasn't saving Martinez out of compassion or duty. He was doing it because it was unexpected, because it would change the pattern of their struggle with Bao in ways that interested him. You're going to help him? Dawson asked, his voice small. Kane's smile never wavered as he administered morphine with practiced care. I'm going to do something much more valuable, Private. I'm going to show our friend Lieutenant Bao that he doesn't understand us quite as well as he thinks he does. He checked Martinez's pulse with clinical precision. He expects us to either abandon our wounded or be slowed to the point of capture. But what if we do neither? What if we show him something new? Martinez's breathing steadied slightly. Under Kane's treatment, the captain's medical skills were as impressive as his tactical ones, which somehow made him even more terrifying. Sir, O'Connor said carefully. Why the change of heart? Kane looked up, and in the fading light his eyes seemed to glow with that inner fire that had nothing to do with compassion. Change of heart? Oh, Sergeant, you still think this is about hearts? He secured the last bandage with practiced. This is about patterns, about showing our opponent that his understanding of human behavior, while impressive, isn't complete. In the distance they could hear movement, the enemy closing in. They had minutes at most before they'd need to move again. He'll live, Kane announced, standing up, for now. And that survival is going to tell Bao something very interesting about who we are. Or rather, his smile widened fractionally. Who he thinks we are. O'Connor watched as Reyes and Thompson prepared to carry Martinez. The wounded man's chances were better now, thanks to Kane's skilled treatment. But somehow that medical expertise, that moment of apparent humanity, had only made their captain seem more inhuman. Because O'Connor understood now, to Kane, saving Martinez wasn't an act of mercy. It was just another move in his game, another way to introduce chaos into the pattern. The fact that it kept a man alive was incidental to its tactical value in his psychological war with Bao. "We need to move," Kane said, already scanning their next route. "Our friend out there will be adjusting his strategy, trying to understand what this means." His eyes gleamed in the gathering darkness. "Let's show him how complicated human behavior can really be." As they lifted Martinez as gently as they could, O'Connor caught Reyes's eye. The young corporal's faith in Kane had been shaken, not by his initial coldness but by this display of calculated mercy. Because now they all understood. Everything was part of the experiment, even their own humanity. The abandoned village emerged from the jungle like a ghost, its empty huts standing dark against the star-filled sky. The team moved through the shadows, carrying Martinez as gently as they could. But each step drew fresh, whimpers of pain from his lips. They chose the most defensible hut, a small structure with thick bamboo walls and clear lines of sight to the surrounding jungle. The night wrapped around them like a shroud as they settled in, the darkness broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through gaps in the roof. Martinez's condition had deteriorated rapidly in the last hour. The morphine wasn't enough anymore. His skin had gone waxy, his breathing labored. But it was his eyes that told the real story, the growing awareness of his own mortality, the fear that came with it. "Please," he whispered as O'Connor checked his bandages. "Don't leave me. Don't let them take me." Kane watched from the shadows, his face unreadable in the darkness. He hadn't spoken since they'd entered the village, but his eyes never left Martinez's struggling form. "Nobody's leaving you," O'Connor assured the wounded man, but they all heard the lie in his voice. Martinez was leaving them, one shallow breath at a time. The night grew deeper. The team took turns on watch, but sleep came only in fitful bursts, broken by Martinez's increasing distress. His pleas became more desperate, more primal. The morphine wasn't touching the pain anymore. "Make it stop," he begged. "Please, just make it stop." Kane moved then, silent as a shadow, kneeling beside Martinez with his medical kit. His movements were practiced, precise, just as they had been earlier when he'd saved the man's life. "Rest now," Kane said softly, and there was something in his voice that made O'Connor look up sharply. "The pain will be over soon." O'Connor started to rise, but Kane's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Trust me, Sergeant," Kane whispered. "Sometimes mercy wears a cruel face." The morphine syringe caught the moonlight as Kane prepared it. Too much morphine. O'Connor knew it instantly, but before he could move, before he could speak, Kane's hand was already moving. "Sleep well, soldier," Kane murmured as he administered the fatal dose. "Your part in this is done." Martinez's breathing slowed, steadied, then gradually faded away. His face, twisted with pain moments before, relaxed into an expression of peace that seemed obscene in its gentleness. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Dawn found them changed. O'Connor's discovery of Martinez's body, though he'd witnessed the act itself, unleashed something primal in him. He lunged at Kane with a roar that carried years of suppressed rage. "You murdered him." The words tore from his throat as Reyes and Thompson struggled to hold him back. "He trusted you. We all trusted you." Kane stood calmly, unmoved by the display of fury. "I ended his suffering. Would you have preferred to leave him to the enemy? To whatever slow death infection would have brought?" His voice carried that same lecturing tone, as if explaining a particularly interesting tactical problem. "Everything is a choice, Sergeant. Everything has a cost." Dawson had retreated to the corner, his young face a mask of horror. He couldn't even look in Kane's direction anymore. Reyes stood, between them, his loyalty warring with his conscience. "Sir," he managed finally, "there had to be another way." "There's always another way," Kane agreed, that same gentle smile playing at his lips. But other ways have other costs. I chose the cleanest end to a problem that had no good solutions. He tilted his head, studying O'Connor's rage with academic interest. The interesting part isn't what I did. It's how you're all reacting to it. The sound of movement outside silenced them all. Through gaps in the bamboo walls, they saw them, Viet Cong soldiers, moving with practiced stealth through the village. They had found Martinez's body, left where Kane had ordered it placed, just visible enough to be discovered, just hidden enough to suggest they were trying to conceal it. Right on schedule, Kane murmured, watching the enemy's movements with satisfaction. Bao understands the value of a body, the story it tells, the questions it raises. O'Connor felt the rage drain from him, replaced by a cold horror. You planned this, all of it, even where to leave him? Of course. Kane's smile never wavered. Everything is information. Everything tells a story. Martinez's death, your rage, their discovery of the body, it's all part of the pattern. He turned to face his team, and in the growing light, his eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire. The village is a trap, but not for us. The team stared at their commander, finally understanding the full scope of his madness. He hadn't just killed Martinez, he had transformed the man's death into another move in his twisted game with Bao. They're coming, Reyes whispered, hearing the enemy moving into position around the hut. Yes, Kane agreed, and there was something like joy in his voice. They think they understand what happened here, they think they know what we'll do next. His smile widened fractionally. Let's show them how wrong they are. The sun rose over the village, painting the sky blood red, and in that light, Kane's shadow seemed to stretch across the floor like death itself, patient, calculating, and utterly without mercy. The first rocket hit the adjacent hut with a thunderous roar, transforming the pre-dawn stillness into an inferno. The blast wave rattled their shelter, sending decades of accumulated dust raining down from the rafters. But even as his team instinctively ducked for cover, Kane remained standing, watching the flames with an expression of almost artistic appreciation. Perfect targeting, he murmured. Bao doesn't waste ammunition. Every shot tells a story. The second rocket came screaming in, and this time Kane moved, but not to take cover. Instead, he positioned himself by the rear window, gesturing for his team to hold their positions. Wait, he commanded as the village erupted in gunfire. Let them think they have us pinned. Dawson was trembling violently, his rifle shaking in his hands. The young radio man's eyes were wide, unfocused, the 1,000-yard stare of a man whose mind was struggling to process too much horror. They're going to kill us, Dawson whispered. They're going to kill us like Martinez. O'Connor saw the break coming before it happened. Sparky, stay. With me, but it was too late. Dawson bolted, pure animal panic overriding training and discipline. He made it 3 steps before the incoming fire intensified, forcing him back into cover. Kane watched this with clinical interest, as if observing a particularly fascinating experiment. Interesting. Fear has its own patterns, doesn't it? Its own predictable rhythms. Sir, Reyes called out as another explosion rocked the village. What's the play here? Kane's smile was terrible to behold. They think they're pushing us toward the eastern exit, the obvious escape route. He gestured to the burning buildings, the patterns of enemy fire. See how they're hurting us? Beautiful work. Almost perfect. Almost? O'Connor's voice was hard as he tried to calm Dawson, who had curled into a fetal position, hands over his ears. They're thinking like soldiers, Kane explained, his voice carrying that same lecturer's tone even as death reigned around them. But we're not going to think like soldiers anymore. He turned to his team, and in the firelight his eyes seemed to glow with an inner fire. We're going to think like prey. The order, when it came, was insane. Burn the rest of the village. Sir? Reyes stared at his commander in disbelief. Everything burns, Kane insisted. Make it look desperate, uncontrolled. Like we're trying to create chaos to cover our escape. He pointed to specific buildings. Those three first. The smoke pattern will tell a story. Make them believe we're trapped, panicking. O'Connor watched as Reyes hesitated. The Aoi, young corporal's loyalty warring with his instincts. But in the end, training won out. They set the fires as ordered, the flames spreading quickly through the dry bamboo structures. The village became an inferno, a maze of smoke and shadow. The Viet Cong's fire became more sporadic, their carefully planned kill zones disrupted by the unexpected conflagration. Now, Kane ordered, we move. But not east, straight through their lines to the north where they think only a madman would go. That's suicide, O'Connor protested. But he already knew it didn't matter. Kane's eyes held that, look, the one that said the game was already won even if they couldn't see how. Dawson had to be physically dragged to his feet. O'Connor gripped the young soldier's vest, forcing him to move. Stay with me, kid. Just stay with me. They burst from the burning hut into hell itself. The smoke was blinding, the heat intense enough to sear lungs. Enemy fire came in sporadic bursts, but the chaos of flame and smoke made accuracy impossible. Kane moved through the inferno like a demon, every step precise, every movement calculated. He led them straight toward the enemy's strongest position, and directly into their moment of greatest confusion. The Viet Cong, expecting them to break east, had shifted to cover that escape route. Their northern lines had thinned, their soldiers instinctively pulling back from the intense heat of the burning village. They broke through in a burst of desperate violence, close quarters combat in smoke and shadow, where every figure was a potential enemy, every sound could mean death. O'Connor saw Reyes bayonet a Viet Cong soldier who emerged from the smoke like a ghost, saw the young corporal's face as he processed what he'd done, the horror, the recognition that something inside him had changed forever. Kane moved through, it all untouched, almost serene. Each shot he fired was precise, each movement choreographed. He wasn't fighting for survival. He was conducting a symphony of destruction. When they finally broke free of the village, the jungle swallowed them into its dark embrace. Behind them, the fires reached the village's stored ammunition, creating a series of secondary explosions that would cover their tracks. But the cost had been severe. Dawson was practically catatonic, having to be half-carried through the jungle. Reyes moved like a sleepwalker, his eyes haunted by what he'd done. Thompson had taken a bullet in the shoulder, though he refused to slow down. Only Kane seemed energized by the experience. He paused on a ridge, looking back at the burning village with something like pride. Do you see it? He asked. No, one in particular. The pattern we just wrote in flame and blood? The story we just told? His smile was radiant in the pre-dawn light. Bao will read it. He'll understand. And then... His eyes gleamed with that terrible inner fire. Then the real game begins. O'Connor looked at his commander and finally accepted what he had known for hours. Kane wasn't trying to save them. He wasn't even trying to win. He was trying to create something. Something written in death and fire, in broken minds and shattered souls. Something only he and Bao would ever truly understand. The jungle pressed in around them, dark and hungry. And somewhere in that darkness, Bao was indeed reading the message Kane had written in flame and blood. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The jungle had become a living thing, breathing with malevolent purpose as Kane drove them deeper, into its embrace. 12 hours had passed since the village, but it felt like days. The heat was oppressive, the humidity a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, and the creeping certainty that they were no longer moving toward anything, just deeper into Kane's madness. Dawson stumbled again, his skin burning with fever. O'Connor caught him before he fell, feeling the heat radiating from the young radio man's body. Sir, he called out, his voice hoarse from dehydration. We need to rest, Dawson's. Keep moving. Kane didn't even turn around. He maintained the same relentless pace he'd set hours ago, showing no signs of fatigue. The terrain opens up ahead. There's a place I know. A place you know? O'Connor's patience finally snapped. We've been moving in circles for hours. These trails are starting to look familiar. Kane stopped then, turning to face his second-in-command with that unnervingly calm smile. Everything looks familiar in the jungle, Sergeant. That's how it hunts. It makes you think you know where you are, makes you trust your instincts. Then it shows you how wrong you were. They're right, sir. Reyes spoke up, surprising everyone. The young corporal who had followed Kane's every order without question now looked uncertain. Something's not right here. We should have hit the river by now if we were heading north. North? Kane laughed softly. Who said anything? About north? He gestured to the jungle around them. Direction is an illusion here. We're not moving through space anymore. We're moving through something else. Through what? O'Connor demanded, his hand tightening on his rifle. Kane's eyes seemed to glow with that inner fire that had become more pronounced with each passing hour. Through understanding. Through the space between what we think we are and what we're becoming. That's enough. O'Connor's voice cracked like a whip. These men need rest, water, and a clear plan. Not more of your philosophical slur. The sound stopped him cold. From somewhere in the jungle came a scream. Not human, not animal, but something in between. Dawson pressed his hands to his ears. Make it stop, he whimpered. Please make it stop. I can hear them. I can hear them all. Interesting, Kane murmured, studying Dawson's breakdown with clinical detachment. The jungle speaks to each of us differently, shows us what we're ready to see. He's delirious, O'Connor growled. He needs medical attention. He needs to understand, Kane corrected. They all do, and they will. Very soon. He pointed to a barely visible trail leading down into a ravine. Through there. What you're looking for is through there. The ravine was a wound in the earth, deep and dark. The team descended single file, their boots sliding on moss-covered rocks. The air grew cooler, heavier with moisture. And then they saw it. The bodies. 5 Viet Cong soldiers lay scattered across the ravine floor, their weapons still clutched, in death-rigid hands. But it was the manner of their deaths that made even O'Connor's combat-hardened stomach turn. They hadn't been shot. They hadn't been blown up. They had been taken apart, methodically, almost surgically. And the patterns of blood on the rocks, the positioning of the bodies, it told a story that made no sense. Jesus Christ, Reyes whispered, crossing himself. Kane moved among the corpses like a curator in a museum, studying each one with fascinated attention. A beautiful work, he murmured. See the precision, the attention to detail? This wasn't about killing. This was about sending a message. What kind of message? Thompson asked, his voice shaking. That we're not the only ones playing this game. Kane's smile widened as he examined a particularly gruesome wound. The jungle has its own players, its own rules. He looked up at his team, and in the filtered sunlight, his eyes seemed almost black. We're not the only predators out here, but we might be the only ones who understand what's really happening. O'Connor watched as Kane circled the bodies, and in that moment, he made his decision. This had gone far enough. Kane wasn't just dangerous anymore. He was leading them into something darker than any of them could comprehend. Dawson had begun mumbling to himself, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there. Reyes stood frozen, his former hero worship of Kane warring with the horror before him. Thompson checked his weapon compulsively, jumping at every sound from the jungle. And Kane looked more alive than ever, more present, as if everything up until this point had been mere preparation for what was to come. Sir, O'Connor tried one last time. Whatever you think is happening here, think. Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. I don't think, Sergeant. I know. I've been here before. This is where it all comes together, where the pattern reveals itself. He gestured to the mutilated bodies. Someone out there understands. Someone is speaking our language. A sound echoed through the ravine, that same not quite human scream they'd heard before. But closer now, much closer. Ah, Kane said, his smile radiant. Right on schedule. Now. He turned to his team, and in his eyes was a madness so pure it had looped back around to something like sanity. Now we find out who's really ready to see the truth. The jungle pressed in around them, alive with unseen watchers. And somewhere in the gathering darkness something waited, something that killed with surgical precision and left its victims as art pieces in a gallery of horror. O'Connor felt it then, deep in his bones. They weren't going to survive this. Not all of them. Maybe not any of them. Because Kane wasn't leading them to safety. He was leading them to whatever had done this. And he couldn't wait to make the introduction. Night fell like a shroud, bringing with it a darkness that seemed to breathe. The jungle's usual nocturnal chorus had changed, becoming something alien and wrong. Familiar sounds distorted into patterns that made the mind recoil. They found the scout just before total darkness, a Viet Cong soldier impaled on sharpened bamboo stakes, his body arranged with an artist's precision. The blood patterns on his uniform formed shapes that seemed almost deliberate, like brushstrokes on canvas. "Don't touch anything," Kane ordered, though no one had moved to do so. He circled the gruesome display, his head tilted in that familiar, analytical pose. "See how the stakes are positioned? The angle of entry? This isn't random violence. This is communication." Communication? O'Connor's voice was dangerous. With who? Kane's smile was radiant in the gathering darkness. With whoever's ready to understand. O'Connor caught Reyes's eye, making a subtle gesture to move apart from the others. When they were far enough away, he whispered, "You see it now, don't you? He's not leading us out. He's leading us deeper in." Reyes's face showed his internal struggle. The young corporal had built his entire military identity around following Kane, believing in Kane's genius. But now, maybe he knows something we don't, Reyes offered weakly. Maybe. The only thing he knows, O'Connor cut in, is that we're all part of whatever sick experiment he's running out here. A sound cut through the darkness, a keening wail that might have been wind through bamboo. Might have been something else entirely. Dawson dropped to his knees, pressing his hands against his ears. "They're moving," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Between the trees. Can't you see them? They're dancing." Kane watched this display with obvious fascination. Interesting. The mind creates patterns even when it breaks, perhaps especially then. "Sir," Thompson spoke up, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here. Whatever's doing this is exactly what we've been looking for," Kane finished. "Though I admit the methodology is unexpected. Beautiful, but unexpected." O'Connor felt something inside him snap. "That's enough. These men are falling apart, and you're treating it like some kind of theatrical performance." The explosion came without warning, a hidden trap triggered by Thompson's next step. The blast threw him 10 feet, his body landing broken among the undergrowth. The jungle erupted in chaos as everyone dove for cover, unsure if more explosions would follow. Everyone except Kane. He stood perfectly still, watching the panic spread through his team like ripples in a pond. "Now we see," he murmured, "who breaks first." Reyes scrambled to Thompson's side, but it was already too late. The blast had torn him apart. Another man dead. Another soul claimed by Kane's relentless push into the darkness. "You knew," O'Connor accused, his voice shaking with rage. "You knew there were traps here." "I suspected," Kane corrected mildly. "The pattern suggested it, but confirmation requires testing." His eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Everything is a test, Sergeant, even grief, even fear, especially fear." Dawson had begun talking to someone who wasn't there, carrying on a conversation with Thompson's ghost, apologizing over and over for not seeing the trap in time. His mind was fracturing visibly now, reality splitting along the fault lines of trauma. "Sir!" Reyes called out suddenly, his voice tight with panic. Movement in the trees. They all turned, weapons raised, but the darkness between the trunks remained impenetrable. Yet something was there, shapes that seemed to shift and flow, always just at the edge of vision. "I see them too," Dawson whispered. "They're beautiful, like shadows made of smoke." Kane's smile widened fractionally. "The jungle is speaking to us now. All we have to do is listen." He turned to his team, and in the darkness his eyes seemed to glow with that terrible inner fire. "Can you hear it? The message hidden in the chaos?" And then they all heard it. Voices in the darkness, American voices, familiar voices, their own voices calling out to each other from different directions, creating a disorienting chorus of confusion. "That's impossible," Reyes breathed. "How?" "Everything is possible here," Kane replied softly. "The jungle mirrors what we bring to it. Our fears, our desires, our capacity for violence." He gestured to Thompson's broken body. "Our willingness to sacrifice." O'Connor moved closer to Reyes, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to end this, now, before he gets us all killed." But Reyes's eyes were fixed on Kane, watching the way their commander seemed to drink in the darkness, the chaos, the fear. "What if he's right?" Reyes whispered back. "What if there really is something out here, something we need to understand?" The voices in the jungle grew louder, more insistent, their own words twisted into meaningless sounds, then back into words again. Dawson began to laugh, a high, brittle sound that held no humor, only breaking sanity. And through it all, Kane watched, waited, studied their reactions with the same clinical detachment he'd shown the mutilated bodies in the ravine. "Beautiful," he murmured. "Do you see it now? The pattern revealing itself?" He spread, his arms wide as if embracing the darkness and all its horrors. "We're not just walking through the jungle anymore. We're walking through the space between sanity and madness, between what we think we are and what we're becoming." The voices called again, using their names now, using phrases only they should know. And in the darkness between the trees, something moved with purpose, with intelligence, with hunger. They weren't alone in the jungle anymore. They might never have been alone. And Kane's smile said he'd known it all along. The temple emerged from the pre-dawn mist, like something from a fever dream. Ancient stone walls half swallowed by jungle. Growth, its architecture belonging to no civilization O'Connor could name. Centuries of vegetation had transformed it into a hybrid of man's work and nature's will, creating something that seemed to shift and breathe in the growing light. Kane stood before it like a man coming home. "You've been here before," O'Connor said. It wasn't a question. "Many times," Kane replied, his voice distant, almost dreamy. "In many ways." He ran his hand along the moss-covered stones, fingers tracing patterns that only he could see. "The French found it in 46, lost an entire platoon here. The Viet Minh tried to use it as a base in 54, but..." His smile widened fractionally. "The jungle had other ideas." "Sir?" Reyes spoke up, his voice uncertain. "How do you know all this? This place isn't on any maps." Kane turned to face his team, and in the gray morning light his eyes seemed almost black. "Some things aren't meant to be mapped, Corporal. Some places exist in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to learn." They entered through a breach in the outer wall, moving into a courtyard littered with bones. Not just recent casualties. There were layers of death here, strata of conflict stretching back decades, centuries. "The high ground," Kane announced, gesturing to the temple's upper levels. "Multiple firing positions, clear lines of sight in all directions. The perfect place for a last stand." "A last stand?" O'Connor's voice was hard. "Or just our last stop. That depends entirely on what we're willing to learn." Kane moved through the ruins with the familiarity of a curator in his own museum. The French thought this was just a defensive position. The Viet Minh thought it was a fortress, but they never understood what it really was. "And what's that?" Reyes asked, unable to hide his growing unease. "A classroom." Kane's smile was radiant. "Everything teaches if you know how to learn, even death, especially death." Dawson had been growing more agitated with each step into the temple complex. His eyes darted between the shadows, his breathing becoming more erratic. "We can't stay here," he whispered. "They're watching, they're always watching." Before anyone could stop him, he turned and ran. Not toward the jungle, but deeper into the temple complex. His footsteps echoed off ancient stones as he disappeared into the shadows. "Dawson!" O'Connor started after him, but Kane's voice froze him in place. "Wait." The arrow appeared as if from nowhere, a silent black shaft that took Dawson in the shoulder, spinning him around, and dropping him to the stone floor. His scream echoed through the temple, bouncing off walls that had heard countless such cries before. Kane hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched. "Right on schedule," he murmured. "Now we begin." "You knew," Reyes whispered, horror dawning in his voice. "You knew they were already here. You knew everything." "Of course." Kane's voice carried that familiar lecturer's tone. "The temple doesn't just attract the lost, Corporal. It attracts those who understand its true purpose." He gestured to the walls around them, to the bones beneath their feet. "This place has been gathering soldiers for centuries, drawing them in, teaching them, testing them." O'Connor moved to help Dawson, who lay whimpering on the stone floor, the arrow shaft protruding from his shoulder like an accusation. But his eyes never left Kane. "How long have you been planning this? How many times have you done this before?" Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Planning implies limitation, Sergeant. I didn't plan this, I merely recognized the pattern, the way the jungle draws certain people to certain places, the way some soldiers are meant to find their way here." More movement in the shadows. Now figures sliding between columns, taking positions in the upper levels. The Viet Cong had surrounded them completely, but they weren't firing. They were waiting. "They're here for the same reason we are," Kane continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "To learn what the temple has to teach. To understand what happens when warfare transcends mere victory or defeat." Dawson's wound was bad, but not immediately fatal. The arrow had been placed with surgical precision, meant to wound, to trap, but not to kill, just like everything else in Kane's elaborate game. "You're insane," O'Connor said quietly, finally voicing what they'd all been thinking. "Insanity is relative, Sergeant, especially here." Kane spread his arms wide, embracing the ancient stones, the watching enemy, the weight of centuries of conflict. "This place exists to teach us that, to show us how thin the line is between tactical genius and madness, between strategy and obsession." Reyes looked between Kane and O'Connor, his loyalty warring with his growing understanding of what Kane truly was. "Sir," he managed finally, "what happens now?" Kane's smile was terrible to behold. Now we show our friends out there what real warfare looks like. We show them why the temple chose us, why it's been waiting for this moment." The sun rose higher, illuminating the temple's upper levels, revealing glimpses of watching figures. Some Americans, some Viet Cong, all drawn to this ancient place by forces they couldn't understand. And in the middle of it all stood Kane, finally home, finally ready to conduct his masterpiece of destruction. They were trapped, surrounded, with a wounded man and dwindling ammunition. But watching Kane's face, seeing the joy there, the pure exultation, O'Connor realized something that chilled him to his core. This wasn't just Kane's plan. This was Kane's purpose. And they were all just notes in his symphony of war. Darkness claimed the temple like a living thing, flowing through ancient corridors and pooling in corners where centuries of shadows had worn grooves in the stone. The team had taken positions in the upper level, where crumbling walls offered both cover and clear lines of sight to the surrounding jungle. But as night fell, sight became meaningless. The whispers began at midnight. "Charlie? Is that you, baby?" The voice drifted through the darkness. A woman's voice, Midwest accent, carrying all the warmth and worry of a mother's love. "They told me you were missing. I've been so worried." Dawson's reaction was immediate and devastating. "Mom?" His voice cracked, childlike. Mom, I'm here. O'Connor grabbed him before he could move, but the damage was done. The psychological attack had found its mark with surgical precision. They've been studying us, Kane observed from his position by a broken window. Learning our weaknesses, our pressure points. Beautiful work, really. His voice carried that same lecturer's tone, as if he were teaching a class rather than watching his men break. Listen to the way they layer the sounds, the ambient noise beneath the voice, the subtle echo effects. They're not just trying to trick us, they're trying to create a complete sensory illusion. More voices joined the first, parents, girlfriends, fellow soldiers, each one perfectly crafted to target specific members of the team. The temple's architecture seemed to enhance the effect, its ancient stones channeling and distorting the sound until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Reyes pressed himself against a wall, his rifle shaking in his hands. "There's something moving out there," he whispered. "Between the trees, it looks like." He stopped, swallowing hard. "It looks like Thompson. But Thompson's dead. Thompson's dead, right?" "The mind creates patterns even in chaos," Kane replied, studying Reyes's growing panic with clinical interest. "Or perhaps..." His smile widened fractionally. "Perhaps the chaos is creating patterns in our minds." O'Connor felt his finger tighten on his trigger. One shot. That's all it would take to end this madness. But which target? Kane orchestrating his symphony of psychological warfare? Or Bao, whose mastery of fear might be even more dangerous? The decision was taken from him when Peters disappeared. One moment the young soldier was at his post watching the western approach. The next, gone. No sound, no struggle. Just the soft whisper of wind through ancient stones and an empty space where a man had been. "Did you see that?" Kane's voice carried something almost like joy. "The precision of it, the artistry, they're not just fighting us anymore. They're performing for us." "Jesus Christ," O'Connor breathed. "You're enjoying this." "Of course." Kane turned to face his second-in-command, and in the darkness, his eyes seemed to glow with that terrible inner fire. This is what warfare becomes when it transcends mere violence. This is art. Dawson had begun rocking back and forth, still whispering responses to his mother's voice. The arrow wound in his shoulder had been dressed, but his mind was bleeding out, spilling sanity into the temple's hungry shadows. "Charlie, baby, please come home." The voice grew closer, more insistent. "I can see you up there. Just come down." "Stop it," Reyes suddenly screamed into the darkness. "Stop it. Just shoot us if you're going to shoot us." Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "They won't. Not yet. That would end the performance too quickly. Watch." As if in response to his words, shapes began moving in the temple courtyard below. Human figures that seemed to shift and change in the moonlight. American soldiers, Viet Cong guerrillas, ancient warriors in forgotten armor. The shadows played tricks, or perhaps the tricks played with shadows. "Sir?" Reyes's voice shook as he approached Kane. "How do you know all this? How do you always know what's coming?" "Because he's been here before," O'Connor answered, before Kane could speak. "Haven't you, sir? How many teams have you led to this temple? How many men have you sacrificed to your art?" Kane's smile never wavered. "Sacrifice implies waste, Sergeant. This..." He gestured to the psychological battlefield unfolding around them. "This is transformation. Every man who dies here feeds the pattern, teaches us something new about the true nature of warfare." A new sound cut through the night, the soft twang of a bowstring. Another arrow materialized from the darkness, this one embedding itself in the stone wall inches from Dawson's head. A message was attached. "Come down and join us. The Moir Temple wants you all." The words were written in perfect English, but beneath them were other scripts, Vietnamese, French, and something older, something that seemed to squirm on the paper like living things. "You see?" Kane's voice was almost tender. "They understand. They're part of it now, too. Part of the pattern. O'Connor looked at his remaining men, Reyes fighting to maintain his sanity, Dawson lost in a world of maternal ghosts. The space where Peters had been still empty and accusing. The enemy was inside their minds now, turning their fears and hopes into weapons. And through it all, Kane watched, studied, conducted his symphony of psychological destruction with the passion of a true artist. The real attack would come soon. But O'Connor was beginning to understand that bullets and blood would be mercy compared to what was happening now. Because the temple wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a crucible, burning away everything, human in them, leaving only the pure geometry of warfare behind. And Kane was its high priest. The first flames appeared like serpents' tongues, licking up the trunks of ancient trees. Bao had chosen his moment perfectly. The dry season had turned the jungle into kindling, and the wind carried the fire straight toward the temple. Within minutes, the night exploded into an inferno. Kane watched the approaching wall of flame with something like rapture on his face. Beautiful, he breathed. He's not just attacking us. He's changing the entire nature of the battlefield. The smoke hit them first, thick and choking. The temple's upper levels became a crucible of heat and toxic fumes. Men doubled over, coughing, eyes streaming. "We need to fall back," O'Connor shouted over the roar of the flames. "The whole place is going to become an oven." But Kane's smile only widened. "Don't you see? The fire eliminates the shadows, forces everything into the light." He turned to his remaining men, his eyes reflecting the inferno. "This isn't an attack, it's an invitation." Then he gave the order that confirmed his madness. Counterattack, straight into the flames. Reyes looked between Kane and O'Connor, his face a mask of indecision. The young corporal had followed Kane through hell itself, but this... "Sir," Reyes managed, his voice rough from smoke, "we'll burn." "Some of us will," Kane agreed pleasantly. "That's part of the pattern, part of the transformation." He checked his weapon with practiced ease. "The question is, who burns and who transcends?" The explosion came without warning, one of Kane's elaborate traps triggered by the heat. The blast wave sent burning debris raining down on their positions. Another explosion followed, then another, until the night became a symphony of fire and shrapnel. "He's insane," O'Connor whispered, finally accepting what he'd known for hours. His hand tightened on his rifle, finger finding the trigger. One shot. That's all it would take. But Kane was already moving, flowing through smoke and flame like a demon in his natural element. "Follow me," he commanded. "Into the fire. Show them what real warfare looks like." Dawson broke first. The combination of heat, smoke, and psychological trauma finally shattered what was left of his mind. "Mom!" he screamed. "Mom, I can see you!" Before anyone could stop him, he bolted, straight into the inferno. "Dawson!" Reyes started after him, but Kane's hand on his shoulder held him back. "Let him go," Kane said softly. "Some men burn, others become the fire." That was when O'Connor finally snapped. His rifle came up, centered on Kane's back, but before he could squeeze the trigger, a burst of enemy fire forced him to dive for cover. Through gaps in the smoke, they caught glimpses of Bao's men, moving with precision despite the chaos, using the fire as cover for their advance. The temple was surrounded, the flames hurting them exactly where the enemy wanted them. "Sir!" Reyes called out as another explosion rocked the temple. "What's the play here?" Kane's laugh carried over the roar of the inferno. "The play? Look around you. This is what warfare becomes when it transcends mere tactics, when it becomes pure art." From his position in the tree line, Lieutenant Bao watched the Americans' response to his fire attack. He had expected them to retreat deeper into the temple, to fortify their positions. Instead, Kane was leading them out, straight into the flames. "He's mad," one of Bao's officers whispered in Vietnamese. "No," Bao replied quietly. "He's something worse than mad. He's awake." The fire had transformed the battlefield into a scene from hell itself. Ancient stones glowed red in the heat, casting demonic shadows that danced and twisted. The very air seemed to burn. O'Connor found himself facing the choice he'd been avoiding. Follow Kane into what was surely death or make his stand here. End it now. But Reyes made his choice first. The young corporal, who had followed Kane through every horror, finally broke. "I can't," he gasped. "I won't die for your art, sir." Kane's response was almost gentle. "You already have, Corporal. The moment you first followed me into this jungle, you became part of the pattern, part of the transformation." Another explosion lit up the night, and in that flash of hellish illumination, O'Connor saw what Kane had become. Not a man anymore, but an avatar of warfare itself, conducting his symphony of destruction with the passion of a true artist. The jungle burned around them, and in its light all pretense of ordinary combat fell away. This wasn't about survival anymore. It wasn't even about victory. This was Kane's masterpiece, written in fire and blood, performed by men who had no choice but to play their parts until the final curtain fell. And somewhere in the inferno, Dawson's screams became part of the music, a high, piercing note in Kane's symphony of madness. The temple's lower chamber had become an oven, ancient stones radiating heat from the inferno outside. O'Connor gathered what remained of the team, Reyes and the two surviving privates, Miller and Rodriguez, in the relative shelter of a partially collapsed wall. Kane had moved to the upper level, ostensibly to monitor enemy movements, but O'Connor knew better. The captain never did anything for just one reason. "He's going to get us all killed." O'Connor kept his voice low, urgent. "Not because he has to, because he wants to, because we're all just pieces in whatever game he's playing with Bao." Reyes's face was a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. But his strategies work. Everything he predicted. Think about it. O'Connor cut in. The village, the temple, the fire, he knew it all in advance. This isn't strategy, it's orchestration. He's not reacting to the enemy. He's choreographing everything, including us. Miller and Rodriguez exchanged nervous glances. They were young, but they'd seen enough in the past 24 hours to know insanity when they saw it. "Sir," Rodriguez whispered, "what's the play here?" O'Connor laid it out simply. "We take his weapon, secure him, make our own way out of this hell." "And you think he'll just let that happen?" Reyes's voice carried years of watching Kane's tactical brilliance. "You think he hasn't already what, Corporal?" Kane's voice came from behind them, smooth as silk and cold as a snake. None of them had heard him approach. He stood in the archway, silhouetted by the flames outside, his shadow stretching across the chamber floor like a living thing. "Discussing strategy?" Kane's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "Or perhaps, discussing succession?" O'Connor's hand moved toward his rifle, but Kane's next move shocked them all. He held out his weapon, grip first. "Take it, Sergeant, if you truly believe that's the answer." The offer hung in the air between them, impossible and deadly, as a viper's kiss. O'Connor felt the trap but couldn't see its shape. That was the problem with Kane. Even his surrender was a form of attack. "Sir," Reyes stepped forward, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" "Offering a choice, Corporal. That's what this has always been about. Choices, consequences, the geometry of decision under fire." Kane's eyes reflected the inferno outside. "Take the weapon, Sergeant. Take command. Show us your version of survival." O'Connor moved forward slowly, every instinct screaming that this was wrong. His fingers were inches from Kane's rifle when the first RPG hit. The explosion turned the world upside down. Through the ringing in his ears, O'Connor heard the distinctive sound of AK-47s, multiple positions, coordinated fire. The Viet Cong had used their argument as cover for their advance. Kane moved with liquid grace, pulling back his rifle and dropping into a perfect firing position. "Right on schedule," he murmured. "Bao understands the music of warfare better than anyone I've ever known." "You knew," O'Connor snarled, returning fire through the broken wall. "You knew they were coming." "Of course." Kane's smile never wavered as he picked off targets with surgical precision. "Just as I knew you would move against me at exactly this moment. The pattern demanded it." Reyes found himself caught between the two men. O'Connor on his left, Kane on his right, both firing at the enemy, both equally deadly, but representing two completely different versions of warfare, two different versions of survival. "Multiple contacts," Miller shouted. "They're coming through the fire." Dark figures emerged from the flames like demons, their silhouettes distorted by heat waves. The Viet Cong had pushed through, their own inferno, using the Americans' internal conflict as their moment to strike. "Beautiful," Kane whispered, watching the enemy advance through his scope. "Do you see it, Sergeant? The way they're mirroring our own divided state? The symmetry of it?" O'Connor wanted to put a bullet in Kane's head, but the enemy fire was too intense. They needed his rifle, his expertise, his inhuman calm under fire, for now. "Reyes," O'Connor called out. "East wall. Don't let them flank us." But Reyes hesitated, looking to Kane for confirmation. That split second of divided loyalty almost got him killed, a burst of enemy fire sending him diving for cover. "Choose quickly, Corporal." Kane's voice carried even over the gunfire. But remember, every choice is part of the pattern, even hesitation, especially hesitation." The battle transformed the temple chamber into a killing ground. Muzzle flashes strobed against ancient walls, bullet impacts chipping away centuries of history. Blood painted new patterns on old stone. And through it all, Kane fought with the fluid grace of a dancer, each shot placed with artistic precision. He wasn't just fighting the enemy, he was performing for them, showing them his mastery of their own psychological tactics. "Sir," Rodriguez called out between bursts of fire, "we're running low on ammunition." "Are we?" Kane's smile was radiant in the darkness. "Or are we simply approaching the next movement in the symphony?" O'Connor felt it. Then, the true horror of their situation. Even their mutiny had been part of Kane's plan. Even their desperate fight for survival was just another brushstroke in his masterpiece of warfare. The real question wasn't whether they could survive. The real question was whether survival was ever part of Kane's design at all. The gunfire faded into sporadic shots, then silence. Smoke from the jungle fire filtered through cracks in the temple walls, carrying the scent of ash and burning vegetation. Kane gathered his remaining men in what had once been a meditation chamber, its walls carved with scenes of ancient battles. "Look at these." Kane traced the carvings with reverent fingers. "Every war leaves its mark here. Every battle adds another layer to the pattern." His smile was radiant in the dim light. "And now it's our turn to write our chapter." "Sir," O'Connor's voice was hard, "we're out of ammunition, low on water, and trapped in a burning temple. What exactly are we writing here? Our obituaries?" Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Always so literal, Sergeant. This temple isn't our tomb. It's our gateway." He moved to the chamber's central altar, running his hands along its base until something clicked. Ancient machinery groaned within the walls. A section of the floor began to sink, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The temple's true purpose was never worship, Kane explained, his voice taking on that familiar lecturer's tone. It was warfare. The whole structure is honeycombed with tunnels, killing grounds, trap chambers, a three-dimensional battlefield designed by minds that understood war as an art form. Reyes moved closer to the opening, his earlier doubts warring with fascination. "You knew about this? All along?" "Of course." Kane's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "Why do you think I led us here? Led them here?" He gestured toward the jungle where Bao's men waited. Every move, every casualty, every moment of psychological warfare was choreographed to bring us to this exact point. "You sacrificed our men," O'Connor's voice shook with rage. "Martinez, Thompson, Dawson, they all died for this?" "Sacrificed?" Kane's smile never wavered. "No, Sergeant, they were transformed. Their deaths were brushstrokes in a larger canvas, notes in a grander symphony." A burst of enemy fire reminded them of their situation. The Viet and Cong were probing, looking for weaknesses. "Down," Kane ordered. "The tunnels will give us firing positions they'll never expect, angles of attack they can't defend against." O'Connor started to protest, but Reyes was already moving. The young corporal had seen something in Kane's explanation, a glimpse of the tactical genius that had first earned his loyalty. The tunnels were a maze of darkness and ancient stone. Kane led them through with absolute confidence, as if he'd walked these paths 1,000 times before. Perhaps he had. Their first ambush was perfect. A Viet Cong squad pushing into the temple's lower levels never saw the attack coming. Hidden firing ports in the walls allowed Kane's team to eliminate them without taking a single casualty. "You see?" Kane whispered as they collected the enemy's weapons and ammunition. "The temple provides. It always provides." Reyes stared at their handiwork with a mixture of awe and horror. The clinical precision of the kills, the way the ancient architecture had turned simple soldiers into unstoppable hunters. It was brilliant and terrifying. But their victory was short-lived. The sound of explosions echoed through the tunnels, not random destruction, but carefully placed charges. "They're collapsing the tunnels," O'Connor realized. "Bow's sealing us in." "Of course he is." Kane's voice carried something like pride. He sees the pattern too, understands that this isn't just about killing anymore. It's about worthy opponents recognizing each other's mastery. "This is insane," O'Connor snarled. "We're trapped underground with dwindling oxygen and no way out." "Wrong again, Sergeant. We're exactly where we need to be." Kane turned to face his men, and in the darkness his eyes seemed to glow with that terrible inner fire. The temple doesn't just provide weapons. It provides enlightenment, understanding. The true nature of warfare isn't about survival or victory. It's about transcendence. Another explosion rocked the tunnels. Ancient dust rained down from above. "Sir," Reyes spoke up, his voice uncertain. "What's the play here? How do we get out?" Kane's smile was terrible to behold. "Get out? Oh, Corporal. We're not trying to get out. We're going deeper in. The temple has chosen us just as it chose others before us. And now..." His voice took on an almost religious fervor. "Now we become part of its pattern forever." O'Connor watched as Reyes absorbed these words, saw the young corporal's face change as understanding dawned. Kane wasn't trying to save them. He never had been. This wasn't about survival or victory or even warfare anymore. This was about transformation. And as the tunnels collapsed behind them, sealing them into the temple's dark embrace, O'Connor realized the true horror of their situation. They weren't just trapped in Kane's game. They were becoming the game itself. The tunnels breathed. O'Connor felt it with every step, the way the ancient stones seemed to inhale and exhale, the walls pressing in with each breath. Their flashlight beams cut through darkness thick as tar, revealing glimpses of carvings that seemed to move when viewed directly. "Listen," Reyes whispered suddenly, freezing in place. "Did you hear that?" They all heard it. Martinez's voice, somehow both distant and impossibly close. "You left me. You let me die." "It's not real," O'Connor insisted, but his voice shook. "The air's getting thin. We're all oxygen deprived." "Oh, it's real," Kane replied softly. "Just not in the way you think. The temple remembers everyone who dies here, adds their voices to its choir." They turned a corner and found him, Dawson, sitting cross-legged in an alcove, apparently unburned despite running into the inferno. He was talking to the wall, his fingers tracing patterns in the stone that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Sparky?" Reyes moved forward, but Kane's hand shot out, holding him back. "Wait," Kane commanded. "Look closer." O'Connor's flashlight beam revealed what Kane had already seen, Dawson's eyes. They were completely black, as if his pupils had expanded to fill the entire socket, and the patterns he was tracing. They matched the ancient carvings perfectly, though he wasn't looking at them. "The temple found him." Kane's voice carried something like pride. "Showed him its truths. Beautiful, isn't it?" "Beautiful." O'Connor fought down rising nausea. "He's gone insane." Insanity is just another word for transformation. Kane moved closer to Dawson, studying him like a scientist observing a particularly fascinating specimen. Some minds break when they touch the truth. Others evolve. Dawson's head snapped toward them, those black eyes reflecting their flashlight beams like pools of oil. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes of other voices, other lives. The pattern. It's so clear now. So perfect. Why didn't I see it before? O'Connor felt reality slipping away. The walls seemed to pulse with a light that wasn't light, and in the corners of his vision he saw them. Thompson, Martinez, all the men they'd lost, watching with eyes that gleamed like Dawson's. A click beneath Reyes's foot changed everything. Kane moved with impossible speed, tackling the young corporal as the booby trap triggered. The explosion filled the tunnel with shrapnel and stone dust, but somehow they were both unharmed. Kane had known exactly how to move, exactly where the blast would go. How? Reyes gasped as Kane helped him up. How did you know? Kane's smile was gentle. The temple provides, Corporal. It shows me what I need to see. Just as it's showing you now. O'Connor watched Reyes's face change as he stared at their commander. The young corporal's loyalty, shaken earlier by Kane's apparent madness, was rebuilding itself into something deeper, more primal. The tunnels, go deeper, Dawson announced suddenly, his voice carrying that same multi-toned quality. They want us to go deeper, to see what they've seen. Who wants us to? O'Connor demanded. Who are you talking to? Everyone, Dawson replied simply. Everyone who ever died here. Everyone who ever understood. They're all still here, Sergeant. All still fighting their wars, learning their lessons, becoming what the temple needs them to be. Kane nodded approvingly. You see, even broken minds can speak truth. Perhaps especially broken minds. A sound echoed through the tunnels. Part scream, part song, part something else entirely. O'Connor saw shapes moving in the darkness. Beyond their flashlight beams, heard whispered conversations in languages that had been dead for centuries. We have to go back, he tried one last time. We have to find a way out. Back? Kane laughed softly. There is no back, Sergeant. The temple only moves in one direction, deeper, always deeper, toward understanding. Reyes moved closer to Kane, drawn by the certainty in his voice, the way he seemed to make sense of the madness surrounding them. O'Connor felt his influence over the young corporal slipping away, replaced by something older and darker. They pressed on through the tunnels, following Dawson's strange new awareness of the temple's geometry. The air grew thicker, heavier with age and secrets. The walls continued their breathing rhythm, and in the darkness between flashlight beams, the dead walked beside them. O'Connor felt his grip on reality becoming as uncertain as the ground beneath his feet. Was he following Kane through these ancient tunnels? Or was he lying dead somewhere above, his mind creating these horrors as his last neurons fired? But Kane moved through it all with perfect confidence, his eyes bright with that terrible inner fire. He wasn't just surviving the madness, he was conducting it. And somewhere in the deepest darkness, something waited. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. For Kane. For all of them. They emerged from the tunnels into a pocket of jungle untouched by the fire. The morning air felt thick with moisture and old smoke, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the remnants of the inferno still consuming the forest. Dawson had disappeared again into the darkness below, becoming just another voice in the temple's choir of the dead. O'Connor watched as Reyes stumbled into the light, saw the young corporal's face as he tried to process everything they'd experienced. Underground. The moment had come. It had to be now. Tell him, O'Connor said to Kane, his voice carrying all the weight of his rage and despair. Tell him about Operation Mongoose. Kane's smile never wavered. So you know, that story. Not a story, O'Connor spat. I talked to survivors, from your previous command, the ones you led into that valley in '68. Reyes looked between them, confusion warring with growing dread. Sir? What's he talking about? A tactical exercise, Kane replied calmly. A lesson in the true nature of warfare. A massacre, O'Connor corrected. He led 30 men into a kill zone. Not because he had to, because he wanted to study how they'd react, how they'd die. Just like he's doing now. Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. Such simple terms you use, Sergeant. Massacre, murder. As if death in warfare could be separated from its purpose. He turned to Reyes, his eyes reflecting the morning light like polished stone. Tell me, Corporal, do you want to win, or do you want to live? Those aren't mutually exclusive, O'Connor argued, aren't they? Kane spread his arms wide, embracing the jungle around them. Look at what we've accomplished. The enemy broken, confused, their psychological warfare turned against them. The temple has taught us its secrets, shown us truths that most men die without ever glimpsing. At what cost? O'Connor demanded. Martinez, Thompson, Dawson's sanity. Sir, Reyes spoke up, his voice shaking. Is it true? About Operation Mongoose? Truth is relative in warfare, Corporal, but yes, I led those men into that valley. And yes, most of them died. Kane's eyes took on that familiar lecturer's gleam. But their deaths taught us something invaluable about enemy response patterns, about the psychology of defeat, about the geometry of sacrifice. Reyes took a step back, horror dawning on his face. They were your men. You were supposed to protect them. I gave them something far more valuable than protection, Kane replied. I gave them meaning, purpose. Their deaths weren't just statistics in some general's report. They were brushstrokes in a masterpiece of warfare. A sound from the jungle interrupted them, Bao's men closing in. They had minutes at most before the enemy found their position. He's insane, O'Connor pressed, seeing his chance. He's going to get us all killed just like those other men, just like everyone who's ever trusted him. But Kane wasn't finished. Insane, or simply awake to warfare's true nature? He focused his full attention on Reyes. Think, Corporal. Remember everything you've seen, everything you've learned. The temple showed you truths that most men never glimpse. Are you ready to turn away from that knowledge? To go back to being what you were? Reyes's hand tightened on his rifle. Everything he'd believed in, everything he'd trusted balanced on a knife's edge. I have a plan, Kane continued, his voice hypnotic. One final movement in our symphony. But it requires absolute trust, absolute commitment. His smile widened fractionally. Absolute sacrifice. Don't listen to him, O'Connor pleaded. He's not leading us to victory. He's leading us to transformation through death. And what's wrong with that? Kane asked softly. What better way to transcend the ordinary boundaries of warfare? To become something more than just soldiers fighting and dying for causes they barely understand? The enemy was close now. They could hear movement in the undergrowth, voices speaking rapid Vietnamese. Choose now, Corporal, Kane commanded. Do we remain bound by old limitations, or do we transcend them together? Reyes stood frozen between them. O'Connor with his desperate truth, Kane with his seductive madness. Everything he'd seen in the temple, everything he'd learned about warfare and sacrifice and transformation, churned in his mind. The young corporal who had followed Kane into hell itself faced his final test. Remain human, or become something else entirely. And in his eyes, O'Connor saw the decision forming, saw the moment when faith and fear and fascination finally crystallized into choice. The jungle held its breath, waiting to see which way the sword would fall. The first rocket struck without warning, transforming the pre-dawn calm into chaos. Bao had launched his final assault with devastating precision, his forces emerging from multiple directions in a coordinated wave of destruction. But Kane was smiling. Perfect, he breathed, watching the enemy advance through his rifle scope. They think they're springing their trap, but they're walking into ours. He turned to Reyes, and in his eyes was a question, a test, a final chance to choose. O'Connor saw his opportunity. In the chaos of the initial assault, Kane had turned his back. One shot. That's all it would take to end this madness. His finger tightened on the trigger. No. Reyes's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. The young corporal's rifle was aimed squarely at O'Connor's chest. "Don't do this," O'Connor pleaded, but he already knew it was too late. He could see it in Reyes's eyes, the same terrible fire that burned in Kane's. The transformation was complete. "I understand now," Reyes said, his voice carrying an almost religious fervor. "What he's been trying to show us. What the temple was teaching us, this isn't about survival, it's about transcendence." Kane hadn't moved, hadn't even turned around. He'd known. He'd always known. "The final movement begins," Kane announced, his voice rising above the growing chaos of battle. "Reyes, take the high ground. Drive them toward the temple's western approach. O'Connor." His smile was radiant. "You have exactly 30 seconds to run before I give the order to fire." The jungle erupted in violence. Bao's forces pushed forward in perfect coordination, but something was wrong. Their advance, their positioning, everything was playing into Kane's hands. O'Connor backed away, watching as Reyes took up his position, becoming an extension of Kane's will. The young corporal's movements were precise, practiced, as if he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. "Why?" O'Connor called out over the gunfire. "Why choose this?" Reyes's response chilled him to the bone. "Because he's right. War isn't about winning or losing. It's about becoming something more than human, something perfect." The battle transformed the jungle into a symphony of destruction. Kane conducted it like a maestro, each explosion, each burst of gunfire becoming notes in his masterpiece. The enemy fell into his trap with terrible precision, their own tactical excellence becoming the instrument of their destruction. O'Connor ran, not because of Kane's 30-second warning, but because he finally understood the true horror of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just warfare anymore. This wasn't just madness. This was apotheosis. Behind him, he heard Kane's voice rising above the chaos. "Now, Corporal, show them what true warfare looks like." The sound that followed would haunt O'Connor's nightmares forever. Not just the gunfire and explosions, but the way Reyes laughed as he carried out Kane's orders. The young corporal who had once been the most human of them all had become something else entirely. From his position in the jungle, Lieutenant Bao watched his carefully planned assault dissolve into chaos. His men were being herded into killing zones with surgical precision, their own tactics turned against them with an artistry that bordered on the supernatural. "Who are they?" one of his officers whispered. "What are they?" Bao's response was barely audible. "They are what war has always wanted to become." The morning sun rose over a scene of perfect destruction. Kane stood in the temple doorway, Reyes at his side, both of them untouched by the carnage around them. For the first time since the mission began, Kane's smile reached his eyes. Because he had won. Not just the battle, not just O'Connor's failed rebellion. He had won something far more valuable. A soul transformed by his dark gospel of warfare. Reyes stood straighter, his eyes reflecting the same inner fire that burned in Kane's. He was no longer the young corporal who had followed orders out of trust and loyalty. He had become something else, something that understood the true music of warfare. O'Connor disappeared into the jungle, carrying with him the memory of what he had witnessed. But even as he fled, he knew the truth. There was no escaping what Kane had created. Because war would never be the same again. It had evolved. The jungle had become Kane's canvas, painted in blood and madness. His elaborate network of traps and psychological warfare had shattered the Viet Cong's cohesion, turning hardened guerrilla fighters into panicked prey. Men fired at shadows, at echoes, at their own comrades, unable to trust their senses in the nightmare Kane had created. From his position in the undergrowth, O'Connor watched it all unravel. The bullet in his shoulder made every movement agony, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He had to stop this, had to make Reyes see before it was too late. "Fall back." Bao's voice carried over the chaos, first in Vietnamese, then in English. "Fall back. Break contact. But Kane had planned for this too. The retreat routes were already seeded with horrors. Men who tried to escape found themselves facing psychological traps more devastating than any explosive. The temple's influence seemed to reach out into the jungle itself, turning their own fears into weapons against them. Beautiful, Kane observed from his position on the temple steps. See how the pattern completes itself? How every death adds another layer to the composition? Reyes stood at his side, watching the destruction with that same terrible fascination. But O'Connor saw something else in the young corporal's eyes, a flicker of doubt as he witnessed the full scope of Kane's artistry. This was his last chance. O'Connor burst from cover, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. "Reyes," he shouted, "look around you. This isn't war, it's slaughter. You think this was about survival?" Reyes turned, his rifle coming up instinctively, but he didn't fire. His eyes swept across the battlefield. The bodies, the blood, the men driven mad by Kane's elaborate psychological warfare. "The pattern," Reyes whispered, but his voice held uncertainty. "The transformation. The only thing being transformed here is your humanity," O'Connor pressed. "He's not teaching you warfare, he's teaching you to love death." An interesting perspective. Kane's voice cut through the air like a blade. But incomplete. Death is merely the medium through which we work. The true art is in the breaking points. Those exquisite moments when a mind touches the infinite and either transcends or shatters. From the tree line, Lieutenant Bao watched the unfolding. Drama with the eyes of a man who had seen too much. His forces were in ruins, his careful strategies turned into instruments of their own destruction. And at the center of it all stood Kane, not a man anymore, but an avatar of warfare's darkest potential. "Sir," one of Bao's surviving officers whispered. "What is he?" "The future," Bao replied softly. "Or the end of everything, perhaps both." Reyes stood frozen between his two mentors, O'Connor bleeding but human, Kane pristine but transformed into something beyond humanity. The doubt in his eyes grew stronger as he looked at the carnage around them. "All those men," Reyes said quietly. "All those deaths." "All necessary," Kane assured him. "All part of the pattern. You saw it in the temple, didn't you? The geometry of perfect warfare. This is merely its continuation. The only thing continuing here is your madness," O'Connor snarled. "He never planned to leave this jungle, Reyes. This isn't about winning. It's about turning warfare into a religion. And he wants us all to die for his faith." For a moment, just a moment, something human flickered in Reyes's eyes. He looked at the bodies scattered across the jungle floor, at the men driven mad by Kane's psychological tactics, at the way the temple seemed to pulse with dark satisfaction. But then Kane's hand touched his shoulder and that humanity vanished like smoke. "Choose again, Corporal," Kane said softly. "Between the limited perspective of ordinary warfare and the infinite possibilities I've shown you." O'Connor saw it happen, saw the moment when Reyes's doubt was submerged beneath Kane's influence. The young corporal's eyes took on that familiar fire, burning away the last traces of uncertainty. "I'm sorry, Sergeant," Reyes said, and his rifle steadied. "But he's right. This is what warfare was always meant to become." Kane's smile was radiant as the morning sun painted the jungle red. "The final movement approaches," he announced. "And now, Sergeant O'Connor, you have a choice of your own to make." But looking at the battlefield, at the bodies, at the madness, at what Reyes had become, O'Connor realized there was no choice left at all. There was only the hunt. And it wasn't over yet. Lieutenant Bao emerged from the jungle like a ghost, his uniform torn and bloody but his eyes burning with fierce intelligence. He carried no weapon, he didn't need one. "A word, Captain Kane." His English was perfect, cultured. One practitioner of the art to another? Kane's smile widened fractionally. "Ah, the master reveals himself at last." He turned to Reyes. "Guard the perimeter. The lieutenant and I have much to discuss." "Sir," Reyes started to protest, but Kane silenced him with a gesture. The final lesson requires privacy, Corporal. Watch and learn. They walked into the jungle together, predator and predator, leaving Reyes and O'Connor alone in the blood-soaked clearing. The morning sun cast strange shadows through the smoke-stained canopy, making reality seem fluid, uncertain. Check. His pack, O'Connor whispered, his voice weak from blood loss. While we have the chance, see what he's been carrying. Reyes hesitated, loyalty warring with growing unease. But something in O'Connor's tone made him move. Kane's pack was military issue, weathered but meticulously maintained. Inside, they found it. A hand-drawn map unlike anything they'd seen before. These aren't extraction routes, Reyes said slowly, horror dawning in his voice. These all lead deeper into parts of the jungle that aren't even on military maps. Because he never intended to leave, O'Connor pressed. Look at the patterns, the calculations. He's been planning this for years. Leading people here, watching them break, feeding their deaths into whatever mad pattern he's creating. Deeper in the jungle, they heard Kane and Bao talking. Their voices carried on the morning air, two masters of warfare discussing their craft. You understand, don't you? Kane's voice was almost gentle. The limitations of conventional victory. The beauty of perfect transformation through combat. I understand, Bao replied calmly, that you are what warfare would become if it achieved consciousness. The pure geometry of death unmarred by human concerns. Beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful and terrible. That's why it has to end. Reyes stared at the map, his hands shaking. The routes, the calculations, the careful notes in Kane's precise handwriting, all of it pointing to something beyond mere survival or victory. What have I done? He whispered. What have I become part of? There's still time, O'Connor urged. We can end this. We can... The gunshot cut through the jungle like thunder, followed by absolute silence. Birds took flight, their wings dark against the smoke-stained sky. Reyes and O'Connor waited, barely breathing, for some sign of who had survived the encounter. Footsteps approached through the underbrush, slow, measured, confident. Kane emerged into the clearing, his uniform pristine despite everything. Only a small splash of blood on his collar suggested violence. A worthy opponent, he announced, his eyes gleaming with that terrible inner fire. He understood. In the end, he truly understood. But Reyes was still staring at the map, at the evidence of Kane's true intentions. Sir, he managed, his voice shaking. These routes, they don't lead out. Of course they don't. Kane's smile was radiant. They lead exactly where they need to, where we all need to go, to our deaths, O'Connor said quietly. To transcendence, Kane corrected. Through the perfect geometry of warfare, beyond the limitations of mere survival or victory. He looked at Reyes, and his eyes held all the passion of a prophet revealing divine truth. That's what you felt in the temple, isn't it? The first touch of something greater than human warfare, something pure. Reyes stood frozen, the map trembling in his hands. Everything he'd believed in, everything he'd followed, now revealed as something darker and more terrible than he'd imagined. Now, Kane continued, his voice taking on that familiar lecturer's tone. We begin the final movement. The culmination of everything we've learned, everything we've become. But looking at Reyes's face at the dawning horror there, O'Connor saw something he hadn't dared hope for. A chance. One last chance to save what remained of the young corporal's humanity. If there was still time. If it wasn't already too late. Kane emerged from the shadows like something not quite human anymore. Blood darkened his left side where Bao's bullet had found its mark, but he moved as if the wound was irrelevant, as if his body was merely a vessel for something that had transcended physical concerns. He wiped his knife clean with ritualistic precision, the blade catching the morning light like a promise. It's almost over, he said to Reyes, his voice carrying that same hypnotic quality that had led them all into this nightmare. But now there was something else in it, a resonance that seemed to echo in the bones. Reyes found himself nodding, knowing what Kane would say before he said it. The temple's influence, Kane's teachings, the pattern of death and transformation, it had all become part of him, writing itself into his consciousness like a virus rewriting DNA. No, O'Connor's voice was weak but determined. No more, following. No more death. He struggled to his feet, blood soaking his bandages. Reyes, this is your last chance, your last moment to make this right. Reyes stood frozen, looking at the destruction around them. The jungle still burned. In places, smoke turning the morning sun blood red, bodies lay scattered across the battlefield. American, Vietnamese, all transformed into brushstrokes in Kane's masterpiece of warfare. Look what we've done, Reyes whispered. Look what we've become. Movement in the underbrush drew their attention. A figure stumbled into view. Dawson, or what remained of him. His eyes were still that terrible black, but now they seemed to hold something else. Something he'd seen in the temple's depths. He showed me, Dawson mumbled, his voice carrying echoes of other voices. In the dark, before the fire, he showed me what war really is, what it wants to become. What did he show you? O'Connor demanded. But Kane was already moving, heading deeper into the jungle with that same measured pace. He didn't look back to see if anyone would follow. He didn't need to. Sir, Reyes called out, his voice uncertain. You're wounded. You need medical attention. Kane's laugh was soft, almost gentle. This body is wounded, Corporal, but we've moved beyond such limitations, haven't we? The pattern demands completion. The transformation requires its final movement. O'Connor grabbed Reyes's arm with his good hand. Listen to yourself. Listen to him. This isn't warfare anymore. This is something else. Something that will consume everything. Human in you if you let it. Reyes looked down at his hands, remembering everything they'd done. The men he'd killed, the horrors he'd embraced, the way warfare had become something beautiful and terrible under Kane's guidance. I have to know, he whispered. Know what? How it ends. What we're becoming. What war really is. His eyes reflected that same fire that burned in Kane's. Don't you see? We're part of something bigger now. Something that was here before us, something that will be here after us. That's the temple talking, O'Connor insisted. The madness Kane fed into your mind. But Reyes was already moving, drawn toward Kane's retreating figure like iron to a magnet. His steps were sure, purposeful, as if he too had transcended mere physical concerns. Reyes, O'Connor called out one last time. You're not just choosing for yourself, you're choosing for everyone who comes after. Everyone who might encounter what Kane is creating out here. Reyes paused, looking back one last time. In his eyes, O'Connor saw the war between humanity and transformation, between the soldier he had been and whatever Kane was molding him into. Maybe that's the point, Reyes said softly. Maybe that's what war has always been waiting for, someone to understand its true nature, someone to give it a voice. Dawson laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The pattern completes itself. The circle closes. War becomes conscious. Kane's figure was barely visible now through the jungle's green gloom, but his presence seemed to fill the air, as if he had become something more than physical. An idea that had achieved consciousness, a theory of warfare that had learned to walk. Reyes took another step toward that retreating figure, then another. Following Kane not because he had to, but because he had become incapable of doing anything else. O'Connor watched him go, understanding finally that some transformations couldn't be undone. Some choices once made rewrote everything you were. Kane had won. Not just the battle, not just their loyalty. He had won the right to become something more than human. And he was taking Reyes with him. O'Connor's rifle felt impossibly heavy. As he raised it one last time, blood loss and exhaustion made the world swim around him. But he forced himself to focus on Reyes's back as the young corporal moved to follow Kane into the jungle's embrace. Stop. The word came out as barely, more than a whisper, but Reyes heard it. He always heard his sergeant's voice, even now. Reyes turned slowly, and in his eyes O'Connor saw everything they had been to each other. Mentor and student, veteran and rookie, brothers in arms. But he saw something else too. Something that had taken root in Reyes's soul and grown into a terrible flowering of obsession. "You don't have to do this," O'Connor managed. "You can still walk away." "Walk away?" Reyes's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Don't you understand? I can't. I need to know what he knows. Need to see what he sees." His eyes flickered toward where Kane had disappeared into the green gloom. The pattern, the transformation, it's all real. We're on the edge of understanding something that warfare has been trying to tell us since the first human picked up a weapon. "It's madness," O'Connor insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. He was too tired, too broken, too lost in the horror of what they'd become. "Is it?" Reyes stepped closer, his voice taking on that same hypnotic quality that Kane used. "Or is madness just what we call things we're afraid to understand?" "The temple showed us truth, Sergeant. Dawson saw them, I saw them, Kane lives them." O'Connor's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. That's all it would take to stop this, to prevent whatever transformation Kane was leading them toward. But he couldn't do it. Not to Reyes. Not to the young soldier who had followed him through countless firefights, who had saved his life more times than he could count. Not to the man who had become more than just another corporal. Under his command, the rifle lowered slowly, not in surrender, but in exhaustion so deep it touched the soul. "He'll kill you," O'Connor whispered. "Not quickly, not physically. He'll kill everything human in you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. But his philosophy of warfare given flesh. Maybe." Reyes's smile was terrible to behold, an echo of Kane's own expression. "Or maybe he'll show me what humanity was always meant to become. What warfare has been trying to transform us into since the first battle was fought." In the distance, they could barely make out Kane's figure, waiting at the jungle's edge. Patient, eternal, as if time itself had become irrelevant to whatever he now was. "Please," O'Connor tried one last time. "Don't let him win." "Win?" Reyes shook his head slowly. "This isn't about winning anymore. This is about becoming." He started to turn away, then paused. "Thank you, Sergeant, for everything you taught me, for showing me what a soldier should be." His eyes met O'Connor's one last time. "But Kane is showing me what a soldier could become." O'Connor watched, helpless, as Reyes walked away. The jungle seemed to reach for him, its shadows wrapping around him like loving arms, pulling him deeper into whatever nightmare Kane was leading them toward. The last thing O'Connor saw was Reyes's silhouette merging with Kane's, the two figures becoming one shadow against the green darkness. Then the jungle swallowed them completely, leaving nothing but silence and the weight of failure. He stood there long after they had gone, his rifle hanging useless at his side, blood still seeping through his bandages. The jungle breathed around, him, alive with whatever power Kane had awakened, whatever truth he had uncovered in its ancient depths. O'Connor understood then that he hadn't just lost Reyes to Kane's influence. He had witnessed the birth of something new, something that would change warfare forever. And he was the only one left to warn the world about what was coming, if anyone would believe him, if anyone could understand. The jungle watched him with ancient patience, keeping its secrets, waiting to see what he would do with the terrible knowledge he now carried. Knowledge of what war could become when it achieved consciousness. When it learned to walk like a man named Kane. The clearing appeared like a revelation, a perfect circle of untouched jungle where no signs of war had ever reached. No bullet holes scarred the trees. No shell craters marked the earth. Even the air felt different here, ancient and heavy with secrets older than human conflict. Kane stopped at its center, his wounds still bleeding but somehow irrelevant to whatever he had become. When he turned to face Reyes, his eyes held something beyond their usual fire, a knowledge so vast and terrible it threatened to consume any who looked too deeply. "Do you know why I chose you, Corporal?" Kane's voice was soft, almost tender. Why, out of all the soldiers who followed me into this jungle, you were the one meant to reach this place? Reyes stood at the clearing's edge, his rifle held loose but ready. Everything that had happened, every death, every horror, every moment of transcendent understanding had led to this. Because I understood, he ventured. Kane's laugh was gentle. No, because you wanted to understand. The others, they followed out of duty, fear, blind trust. But you followed because you sensed there was something more. Something warfare was trying to tell us. If only we had the courage to listen. What is this place? Reyes's voice shook as he took in the unnatural perfection of the clearing. The only place where war doesn't exist. A void in the pattern. A silence in the symphony. Kane spread his arms wide, embracing the ancient trees. This is where it all began, where I first understood what warfare truly was, what it wanted to become. And what is that? Conscious. Kane's smile was radiant. War isn't just conflict, Corporal. It's an entity, a force trying to achieve awareness through us and through our battles, our strategies, our deaths. And here, he gestured to the clearing. Here is where it first learned to think, to want, to become. Reyes felt it then, the weight of ages pressing down, the accumulated consciousness of every battle ever fought trying to achieve something more than mere violence. You're not human anymore, he whispered. Are you? I haven't been human since I first found this place, since I understood what warfare was asking of us. Kane's voice carried centuries of conflict, millennia of evolution, through violence. I am what war becomes when it learns to walk like a man, when it achieves the consciousness it's been reaching for since the first human picked up a stone and saw its potential as a weapon. And the others? All those soldiers you led here? Tests, experiments, attempts to find someone who could see the pattern, who could understand what warfare was trying to become. Kane stepped closer, his movement liquid grace despite his wounds. And now you're here, now you understand, and you have a choice to make. Reyes's rifle came up, centered on Kane's chest. What choice? The only choice that matters. Stay here. Let go of your humanity. Become what warfare needs you to become. Kane's eyes burned with that terrible inner fire. Or leave. Return to the world of ordinary soldiers fighting ordinary battles. Forget everything you've learned, everything you've seen. And if I choose a third option? Reyes's finger tightened on the trigger. If I end this here, you can't end this, Corporal. You can only choose whether to be part of it. Kane spread his arms wide, offering himself as a target. But before you decide, ask yourself, do you really want to go back? To see warfare as just tactics and strategy? To forget the beauty of perfect conflict, the geometry of transformation through combat? Reyes's hands began to shake. Everything Kane had shown him, everything he had learned, it was terrible, yes, but it was also magnificent. The pattern, the purpose, the sense that warfare was more than just humans killing humans. What happens if I stay? Kane's smile was gentle. You become like me. Not human anymore, but something warfare has been trying to create since the first battle was fought. A consciousness worthy of its purpose. The rifle wavered in Reyes's hands. He thought of O'Connor, of all the men they'd lost, of the horrors and wonders Kane had shown them. He thought of ordinary warfare, of battles fought for causes that seemed meaningless compared to what he now understood. Choose, Kane whispered, before the moment passes, before the pattern moves on without you. Reyes's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that moment, he finally understood. This was never about Kane manipulating him. This was about warfare itself, reaching through Kane, offering him a chance to become something more than human. Something terrible, something perfect. His choice would echo through every battle yet to come. The weight of the rifle seemed infinite in Reyes's trembling hands. Everything that had led them here, every death, every horror, every moment of terrible understanding, balanced on the pressure of his finger against the trigger. Kane stood before him, bleeding but unbowed, his smile gentle as a lover's. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his stance. If anything, he looked peaceful. Waiting. You see it now, don't you? Kane's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it seemed to fill the clearing. Why I chose you. Why the jungle chose us both. Reyes's finger tightened on the trigger, then loosened. A terrible understanding began to dawn. You want this, he breathed. You've always wanted this. Kane's laugh was gentle. Want? No, Corporal. Want implies desire, implies choice. This isn't about want. This is about becoming. Blood darkened his uniform, but he seemed beyond such physical concerns. The jungle always wins, not because it's stronger, but because it's patient, because it understands what warfare really is. Movement in the shadows caught Reyes's attention. O'Connor emerged from the undergrowth like a ghost, his own rifle raised despite his wounds. His eyes held nothing but grim determination, the look of a man who had nothing left to give except one final bullet. End it, Reyes. O'Connor's voice was raw. End it now, or I will. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. 3 men, 3 rifles, 3 versions of what warfare had made them, and only one possible outcome. You still think this is about ending something? Kane's smile widened fractionally. This was never about endings. This is about transformation. About warfare achieving what it's always reached for, consciousness through perfect violence. Reyes felt the truth of it in his bones. The weight of the rifle wasn't just metal and wood anymore. It was every bullet ever fired, every soldier ever fallen, every battle ever fought trying to become something more than mere conflict. The jungle always wins, Kane repeated softly. Because the jungle understands. It's been here longer than humans, longer than warfare. It knows what we're becoming. O'Connor's rifle steadied. Reyes, if you can't do it, he can't, Kane interrupted gently. Not because he's weak, because he understands. Don't you, Corporal? You've seen what warfare really is, what it's trying to become through us. Reyes's hands shook harder. The rifle seemed to pulse in his grip, alive with possibilities, with choices, with transformations. The jungle always wins, he whispered. The gunshot shattered the morning silence like thunder. Kane collapsed to his knees, blood blooming across his chest like a flower. But his smile never wavered. If anything, it grew wider, more radiant. Through the clearing gun smoke, through the ringing in their ears, neither O'Connor nor Reyes could be certain whose finger had pulled the trigger. The shots had come simultaneously, or perhaps it had been a single shot that somehow contained both their intentions. Perfect, Kane whispered as he fell. The pattern completes itself. But even as he collapsed, his smile remained, because he knew something they didn't yet understand. Death wasn't an ending. It was just another transformation, and the jungle always wins. The clearing held its breath as Reyes and O'Connor approached, the spot where Kane had fallen. The morning light filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, making reality seem fluid, uncertain. Their boots crushed undergrowth that seemed to whisper with each step, but Kane's body wasn't there. Impossible, O'Connor breathed, his rifle sweeping the area. He was hit. We both saw it. Blood darkened the earth where Kane had knelt, but there was no body. No sign of their commander except that crimson stain seeping into the jungle soil. Search the perimeter, O'Connor ordered, falling back on training when reality ceased to make sense. He couldn't have gone, far not with those wounds. But Reyes wasn't moving. He stood staring at the empty space where Kane had been, his face a mask of dawning understanding and horror. He didn't go anywhere, Reyes whispered. He became exactly what he was meant to become. They found a blood trail leading deeper into the jungle, but it made no sense. The drops didn't follow any pattern of wounded movement. Instead, they formed perfect geometric shapes on leaves and bark like some mad artist's signature. Look at this, O'Connor called out, his voice shaking. The spacing, the arrangement, it's deliberate, like he's still teaching us. Reyes finished, still showing us the pattern. They followed the trail until it simply stopped, mid-path, as if Kane had walked up into the air or sunk into the earth. The jungle around them seemed more alive somehow, more aware, as if it had absorbed something of Kane's consciousness. Then they heard it, his voice, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The jungle always wins. O'Connor spun, rifle raised, but there was nothing to shoot at. The voice seemed to come from the trees themselves, from the very air they breathed. Because this was never about survival, Kane's voice continued, carrying that same lecturer's tone they knew so well. It was about transformation, about becoming what warfare has always needed us to become. He's dead, O'Connor insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. We killed him, we both shot him. Did we? Reyes's eyes were fever-bright as he traced the patterns of blood with trembling fingers. Or did we just help him complete the transformation, become what he was always meant to be? More whispers filled the air, fragments of Kane's teachings echoing through the trees. The pattern completes itself. Warfare achieves consciousness. The jungle understands. O'Connor felt his grip on reality slipping. Nothing made sense anymore. Had any of this been real? Had Kane ever been just a man? Or had he always been something else, something wearing human form until it was ready to become more? But Reyes was smiling now, a terrible echo of Kane's own expression. Don't you see? He whispered. He showed us the truth. Warfare isn't just conflict, it's an entity trying to achieve awareness, and now, he gestured to the jungle around them, to the blood patterns that seemed to pulse with their own light. Now it has. We need to leave, O'Connor managed. While we still can, while we're still. Still what? Reyes's laugh was soft, almost gentle. Still human? Still bound by old limitations? He freed us from that, Sergeant. Showed us what we could become. The whispers grew stronger, more insistent. Kane's voice seemed to come from the very ground they stood on, from the air they breathed, from the blood in their veins. The jungle always wins, it said again. Because the jungle understands. O'Connor watched as Reyes walked to where Kane had fallen, kneeling to touch the blood-soaked earth. The young corporal's face showed something beyond madness, beyond understanding. A terrible enlightenment that transformed him even as O'Connor watched. They had come to kill Kane, to end his influence once and for all. Instead, they had helped him transcend the final barrier between man and myth, between flesh and legend. Kane wasn't dead. He had become exactly what he always was, warfare itself, conscious and aware, walking like a man until it no longer needed human form. And in Reyes's eyes, O'Connor saw that transformation beginning again. They walked through a jungle that felt different now. More alive, more aware, as if Kane's consciousness had spread through every leaf and branch. O'Connor moved on pure instinct, following the sun, each step driven by nothing more than the animal desire to escape. His wounds throbbed in time with his heartbeat, marking the distance between what they had been and what they had become. Reyes followed, but his steps were uncertain. Every few meters he would stop, turn back as if hearing voices in the whisper of leaves. His eyes had taken on that familiar fire, Kane's fire, and it seemed to burn brighter with each passing hour. Do you hear it? Reyes asked suddenly, his voice carrying that same lecturer's tone that Kane had used. The pattern. It's still forming, still teaching. There's nothing to hear, O'Connor managed, though he wasn't sure he believed it anymore. Just jungle, just wind. Wind doesn't speak in geometric progressions. Wind doesn't teach the calculus of perfect warfare. Reyes's smile was terrible to behold. He's still here, still showing us the way. The way to what? More death? More madness? Transformation, Reyes corrected gently. What else has warfare ever been about? The evolution of conflict into consciousness. O'Connor pressed on, trying to ignore the way the jungle seemed to watch them pass, the way shadows moved when they shouldn't. His training told him to maintain a tactical approach to their extraction, but how did you maintain tactics when reality itself had become uncertain? Then they saw it. A break in the endless green, a thinning of the canopy that promised open sky. The normal world waited beyond that threshold, with its ordinary wars and ordinary reasons for fighting them. But Reyes stopped. "I can't," he whispered, though O'Connor hadn't said anything. This isn't right." O'Connor turned to face his friend, his brother in arms, the man who had followed him through countless firefights before Kane had transformed him into something else. "Come back with me," he said simply. "Or don't. But decide now." "Decide?" Reyes's laugh was soft, almost gentle. "Like we decided to shoot Kane? Like we decided any of this?" He gestured to the jungle around them. "We never decided anything. We just became what warfare needed us to become." "That's Kane talking. His madness, not yours." "Is it madness? Or is it just truth that most men aren't ready to understand?" Reyes took a step back, toward the deeper jungle. "You felt it too, in the temple. When the pattern first revealed itself. When warfare started speaking through Kane's voice." O'Connor watched his friend's face, seeing the war being fought behind his eyes. Not the war they'd come here to fight, but the one between what he had been and what Kane had shaped him into. "I can't go back," Reyes said finally. "Not after what I've seen, what I've understood." His eyes reflected that terrible inner fire. Kane showed us that warfare isn't just about fighting. It's about becoming. And his voice caught. "I need to know what we're becoming." The jungle whispered around them, its shadows seeming to reach for Reyes like loving arms. Everything Kane had taught them, everything he had shown them about the true nature of warfare, hung in the air between them. "This is your last chance," O'Connor said quietly. "Walk away with me now, or become whatever Kane was shaping you into." But looking at Reyes's face, he already knew the answer. The transformation had gone too far, reached too deep. Kane's influence wasn't just philosophical anymore. It had rewritten something fundamental in Reyes's consciousness. "The jungle always wins," Reyes whispered, echoing Kane's words. "Because the jungle understands." He took another step back, then another. The shadows seemed to embrace him, welcome him, pull him deeper into whatever mystery Kane had uncovered in these ancient trees. O'Connor stood at the threshold between jungle and sky, between madness and normality, watching his friend become something else entirely, something that wasn't quite human anymore, just like Kane. The war was over, at least for O'Connor, but for Reyes it was transforming into something else. Something eternal, something conscious, something that had been waiting in these jungles since the first human learned to kill. And as O'Connor turned toward the light, toward home, toward whatever was left of his humanity, he heard Reyes's voice one last time. The pattern completes itself. The jungle swallowed him whole. The threshold between jungle and sky stretched before them like a border between worlds. O'Connor stepped into the light first, feeling the weight of the darkness fall away. But something made him turn back. Some instinct, some last thread of connection to the man who had been his brother in arms. Reyes stood frozen at the edge of the tree line, his face transformed by the interplay of sun and shadow. In that moment he looked like neither the young Corporal O'Connor had known, nor the disciple Kane had shaped. He looked like something in between, something still becoming. "You feel it too, don't you?" Reyes whispered, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. "The way the jungle breathes, the way it speaks, the way it understands." O'Connor wanted to argue, to deny, to pull his friend back from whatever precipice he stood upon. But he had seen too much, lost too much to pretend anymore. "Kane showed us," Reyes continued, his voice taking on that familiar lecturing tone. "The jungle was never our enemy, never our prison, it was always our He paused, searching for the right word. Our crucible. Our transformation. Movement flickered in the depths of the jungle, a shadow that moved wrong, a figure that shouldn't exist. O'Connor's rifle came up instinctively, but Reyes's hand pushed it down. Kane? The name escaped Reyes's lips like a prayer. The figure didn't answer, but it didn't need to. They both felt it. The presence that had guided them, shaped them, led them to this moment of choice. Come back with me. O'Connor tried one last time, though he already knew it was futile. Whatever Kane showed you, whatever he made you believe, he didn't make me believe anything, Reyes interrupted gently. He just showed me what warfare has always been trying to become. What we've all been trying to become since the first battle was fought. O'Connor reached for his friend, but Reyes was already moving, stepping back into the embrace of the shadows, letting the jungle wrap around him like a lover's arms. The jungle always wins, Reyes whispered, Kane's words flowing through him. Not because it's stronger, because it understands. In that moment, O'Connor finally accepted what he had known since the temple, since watching Kane transform his friend into something else. He had never been trying to save Reyes. Reyes had always belonged here, had always been meant for this. The figure in the jungle seemed to grow more solid, more present. Not Kane as he had been, but Kane as he had become. Warfare given consciousness, conflict made flesh. Goodbye, Sergeant, Reyes said softly. Thank you for showing me what a soldier could be. His smile was terrible and beautiful. Now I'll learn what a soldier can become. O'Connor watched helplessly as the jungle claimed him. Reyes's figure seemed to blur, to shift, to become one with the shadows that had been waiting for him all along. The last thing O'Connor saw was Reyes's eyes, burning with that same fire that had consumed Kane. Not human eyes anymore, but windows, into something older, something that had been waiting in these ancient trees since the first human learned to kill. Then Reyes was gone. The jungle had won. O'Connor turned away, stepping fully into the light, leaving behind the darkness and its terrible transformations. But he knew with a certainty that would haunt him forever, that somewhere in those shadows warfare itself was achieving consciousness, and Reyes would be there to welcome it, to become it, to complete the pattern Kane had started. The debriefing room felt impossibly small after the vastness of the jungle. O'Connor sat rigid in his chair, watching the officers exchange glances as he recounted what had happened. His wounds had been treated, his uniform replaced, but nothing could clean the jungle from his mind. Captain Kane? The colonel leafed through a folder, frowning. That's impossible. Kane was declared MIA 3 months ago. His entire team was lost behind enemy lines. Sir, I served under him. We all did. He led us to that temple, showed us. Son, the colonel interrupted gently. We found Kane's dog tags 2 months ago. What you're describing, it couldn't have happened. But O'Connor knew what he had seen, knew what Kane had become, what he had transformed Reyes into. The truth was there in his report, written in careful detail. The temple, the pattern, the way warfare itself had achieved consciousness through Kane's terrible understanding. They classified the report, of course, buried it in files too strange to acknowledge, too dangerous to destroy. They listed Reyes as missing in action, another soul lost to the jungle's embrace. They called O'Connor shell-shocked, traumatized, his mind creating fantasies to cope with combat stress. But deep in the jungle, far from maps and military records, something moved through the trees with lethal grace. Reyes no longer needed orders, no longer needed purpose or direction. He had become what Kane had shaped him to be, what warfare itself had been trying to create since the first human raised a weapon against another. His eyes, burning with that familiar fire, saw patterns where others saw only chaos. His movements followed geometries older than human conflict. The jungle breathed with him, through him, teaching him what Kane had learned in these shadowed depths. The jungle always wins. The whisper carried through the trees, and those who heard it could never be certain if it was Kane's voice or Reyes's, or something older, something that had been waiting in these ancient forests since the first battle was fought. Sometimes in the deepest part of night, native villagers would speak of a figure they glimpsed between the trees, a soldier who moved like a shadow, whose eyes burned with strange fire. They couldn't agree if it was an American or a Vietnamese fighter. Maybe it was neither. Maybe it was both. O'Connor would wake sometimes, years later, his mind full of jungle whispers and patterns that denied human understanding. He would remember Kane's smile, Reyes's transformation, the way warfare itself had achieved consciousness in that forgotten temple. The official records were clear. Captain Kane died months before O'Connor's mission. Corporal Reyes was declared missing in action, presumed dead. The temple, if it ever existed, was never found. But in the jungle, something waited. Something watched, something that understood warfare not as a human activity, but as an entity trying to achieve awareness through blood and sacrifice and perfect violence. Some say Kane never left the jungle. Some say he never existed at all. But the jungle remembers, and sometimes in the deepest part of the trees where no maps record and no soldiers dare to venture, you'll hear a whisper, a voice that speaks of patterns and transformation, of the geometry of perfect warfare, of the moment when conflict itself achieved consciousness. Waiting, teaching, becoming. The jungle always wins. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.